July 13, 2016 ATB. Stadtfeld Manor, Tokyo Settlement. 1725. Callan thought it was shocking how a system as expensive as the much-touted Tokyo Settlement maglev could have overlooked something as basic as functional air conditioning during the design process. No such mention of the oversight had made it into the fawning media, of course. Not during the construction phase, and certainly not after the system's twice-delayed grand opening. A tract palace, one particularly brown-nosed presenter had dubbed it, from which all of Britannia's sons and daughters can view the fullness of this new gem in the imperial diadem. Despite the fact that she was no longer free to pursue her budding career as a journalist, Callan found it grimly satisfying that every turning of the seasons proved the lies of the Britannian media again and again. While Prince Clovis had set a circling crown around his capital, the wet heat of the Tokyo summer had still infiltrated the densely packed train carriage with contemptuous ease, turning the tight rush-hour confines into a sweatbox. No matter how much the administration and its Fourth Estate lackeys might claim otherwise, the truth of the matter was manifest to anybody who relied on the magnetically levitating train system for their commute. It's fitting, in a way, Callan supposed, sitting straight-backed in her chair as befit a noble cadet, knees and heels firmly together in emulation of a posture diagrammed in her cadet's handbook, that, try as he might, lie as he might, the viceregal governor cannot keep Japan out of his shiny new train. To say nothing of his settlement. Even in her own ears, the connection sounded tenuous and forced. While Clovis's incompetence as a leader and as a manipulator of perception were manifestly apparent, equating the all-pervading seasonal humidity to Japanese nationalism was a harder sell. The comparison didn't really make much sense, especially since the Britannians and their lackeys seemed entirely unconcerned with the ongoing struggle for liberation. The death of the Yokohama sniper the previous week, damn you, Chihiro. Had inspired a satisfied if short-waved burst of elation throughout the Britannian concession and the broader Tokyo settlement. The heat, by contrast, had popped open collars, loosened ties, and in some extreme cases, even forced some of the office workers packing the car to remove their jackets entirely. Sitting prim and proper in her army grey ROTC uniform, Callan took the opportunity to glare at a particularly scrawny example of this last breed, silently venting some of her frustration on the pasty-faced man seated across from her on the opposite side of the train and enjoying his obvious discomfort. He'd had the misfortune to attempt what she was sure he considered a winning smile on her when they had first made glancing eye contact across the train car. Callan had spent the rest of the trip punishing the fool for his mistake. Serves him right, Callan thought, satisfied with the misery she'd returned in some small way back to Britannia. Who the hell smiles at a girl on a train? Creeps, that's who. Bastard. Even her attempts to spark self-righteous fury felt damp and half-hearted, sapped into exhaustion by the cloying heat and the strain of keeping the mask of Callan Stadtfeld firmly in place. It had been another long day at Ashford Academy, the grounds of which were almost deserted now that summer vacation was in full swing. Almost all of the noble student body had fled the Tokyo settlement in favor of South Pacific vacations or summer homes on mountain estates, high above the swampy summer heat. A few even went back to the homeland, back to the festering cesspool of human rot they liked to call civilization. Now the campus was populated only by the handful of students who lived full-time in the dorms and by the ROTC cadets, whose vacation had been given over fully to their training. Judging by the expressions of her fellow cadets when they had heard the news, Callan reckoned that only she had actually read the enlistment papers before signing up. If any of her fellows had done the same, they wouldn't have been surprised by this development, especially considering how behind the fledgling cohort was in achieving the mandatory training benchmarks laid out in the cadets' handbook each had been issued after taking the oath. Every page of which Callan had committed to memory. While her fellow cadets might be content to merely play at soldier, she had no such freedom. For a variety of reasons, ranging from her own standards to her secret mission, Callan couldn't afford her ROTC career to be anything less than exemplary. So, she leaned in. Using her rank as cadet sergeant, Callan had reserved a place for herself at the front of every class, taking notes and asking questions right under the noses of the revolving cast of army officers Major Pitt brought in to serve as guest lecturers. The major himself generally sat in the rear of the classroom, well outside of Callan's field of vision, but the pressure of his gaze never lifted from her shoulders. Every time she glanced back, the major's watchful eyes met hers until she returned her focus to the lecture. The washed-up old pilot had clearly identified her as his meal ticket, and just as clearly had no intention of letting her slip away from his tight-fingered grasp. The regard of her fellow cadets weighed almost as heavily on Callan's shoulders as the focus of their mentor. In the classroom and out on the training field, every eye turned towards her, following her every move and evaluating her every word. But I'd expected as much, Callan thought resentfully, channeling a bit of her anger into a clenched fist as she bit down on a scowl. No thanks to him and his stupid title. Attention had followed her, ever since Alvin Stadtfeld had reclaimed her and made her his heir. New Leicester was, all things considered, a minor barony without any great incomes attached to it, but that didn't really matter. It was still a fiefdom in the homeland itself, and therefore prestigious. As its heiress, even though she had yet to be formally introduced to society as such, Callan had been rendered prestigious as well. And that's not even getting into all of the other reasons creeps keep sneaking looks at me from the corners of their eyes when they thought I wouldn't see. She had nothing but contempt for all 6 of them, male and female alike, almost as much contempt as she had for Pitt. They were all Britannians to the core, avaricious and scheming, smug in their superiority and proud in their duplicity. Just like with Pitt, Callan kept her true feelings secret, guarding her thoughts with cool smiles and a single-minded focus on her duties as a cadet. So far, during the summer training camp, Callan had spoken only to issue commands during formation practice, to ask questions during lecture, or to endlessly bark yes sir. To Pitt's satisfaction. Both to advance her true mission and to preserve her sanity over the summer, Callan hurled herself into her training. Again, she had leaned into Cadet Sergeant Stadtfeld, playing her role to the hilt. To her muted horror, Callan found herself greatly enjoying the intensive summer program, particularly the physical components and, worst of all, the time spent in the nightmare simulator. The intensive program played to her strengths to an extent she would have found otherwise disturbing had it not quickly become her refuge. Every morning, Callan left Stadtfeld Manor at 6, vanishing long before her drunk of a stepmother stirred and arriving at Ashford by 7 for morning PT. After an hour of running, push-ups, and crunches, 4 hours of classwork began, with lectures ranging from nightmare specifications and upkeep to basic tactics to army culture. Another hour of PT followed the half-hour set aside for lunch, and was in turn followed by 3.5 hours of simulator time spent running scenarios and learning how to pilot in earnest. A quick shower later and she was on a train back to the manor, where she cloistered herself away in her room to review all the notes of the day's academic workshops and expand her knowledge on any points of interest referenced in class. Unpleasant colleagues aside, it all came so easily to her. The classwork, which covered relevant topics like physics and mechanical engineering as well as all the rot about the history of the army and such, seemed far simpler than Callan's usual classes. Either the ROTC curriculum had been dumbed down so every cadet no matter how inbred could comprehend its contents, or her desire to not think about anything but the task on hand had sharpened her mind's edge to a razor hone. Likewise, she stood easily head and shoulders over her fellow cadets on the practice field, beating their track times and continuing to crank out push-ups long after everybody else had collapsed into the dust. Of course, it was on the simulators where Callan truly shined. While the same twisting, knotted agitation that she had experienced back during the recruitment assembly rose in her belly every time the simulator's hatch closed behind her, it grew easier and easier to ignore the momentary spike of nausea with each session. The voices and flashbacks were harder to push past fully, but with hours in the simulator every day, the edges slowly grew less jagged, the voices less loud. Now arriving at Emperor Albert II station, a cool female voice chimed through the train's overhead speakers, the only thing cool in the sweltering cabin. Doors will be opening to your left. Please remain clear of the opening doors. As the levitating train slowed to a smooth stop, none of the jolting Callan dimly remembered from the long dead, but not sweltering, Tokyo Metro in evidence, She rose to her booted feet and pulled her ROTC-issued rucksack down from the overhead rack, its cargo of filthy workout gear and notebooks smacking into her back as she slung it over her shoulder. Across the train car, the pale office drudge let out a sigh of relief as she began to walk away, only to stiffen up again as she spun on her heel to glare at him. That last moment of discomfort would be the final drop of pleasure she would wring from the day, of that Callan was gloomily certain. She was returning to the place she felt least comfortable these days, a hollow shell of a home that was no longer anything of the sort, bereft as it was of the friendly face of her real mother. Compared to that absence, or to the presence of her drunken hag of a stepmother and all of her cronies, Callan almost found herself longing for the bores who made up the remainder of her training cohort. Honestly, a corner of Callan's mind huffed as she made her way down the station steps to street level. You have no reason to be this petty. Lelouch and Millie even stole you away for lunch today, so you didn't have to play polite in front of Major Pitt. Today was a good day. A vague flicker of guilt wormed its way up from Callan's gut. Perhaps the office drudge had just been trying to be friendly? Now that she thought about it, he hadn't been that much older than her, only 2 or 3 years at most. Even if he had been trying to flirt, at least he'd been far more subtle about it than her overly bred fellow cadets. Who gives a shit? Callan asked that annoyingly reasonable part of her mind incredulously. He's a Britannian. He should consider himself lucky I didn't kill him where he stood on Japanese soil. Or sat, at least. I already showed him far too much mercy. Her traitorous mind didn't offer up any further arguments, but Callan couldn't quite shake that heavy, guilty feeling that rolled around in her gut as she listlessly made the short walk to the nearest bus stop. Tired of the day and depressed that even her momentary joy of ruining a Britannian's commute home had been spoiled, she slumped down in the first open seat she could find and just stared straight ahead. Thankfully, the bus had functional air conditioning, and the cool air was so welcome on her sweaty skin that Callan almost missed her stop, hesitant as she was to leave the sanctuary for the cicada-haunted humidity outside. The clatter of those insects intensified as Callan keyed herself through the pedestrian gate and made her way up the walk paralleling the driveway, passing through the ornamental ring of trees surrounding Stadtfeld Manor her father had once jokingly named the forest. Alvin Stadtfeld had sourced those mulberry trees from the slopes of Mount Kamotari, in what had once been Chichibutama Kai National Park, ordering that they be dug up before they could be logged and replanted on the grounds of his new family estate in Area 11. Callan had distant memories of enjoying a trip to that national park as a very little girl with Naoto, her mother, and her father. Those memories might have faded entirely with age if it wasn't for the framed photo of her, Naoto, and her mother together, Mount Kamotari rising behind them. Her father had taken that picture. Now, the handful of refugee mulberries sheltered Stadtfeld Manor from any inquisitive eyes that might peer over the boundary wall or through the bars of the gates protecting the driveway and the pedestrian access. Not that there's anything really worth hiding there now, thanks to Tanya. With practiced effort, Callan pushed the stab of anger away. She fully understood why her leader had ordered Naoto to take their mother away to safety. In the heat of the moment, Callan had even found herself appreciative, touched even, that Tanya would take the time to care for her and Naoto's mother. It had been a relief during that first crowded week, as Callan worked to mold herself into the perfect image of a Britannian student soldier and calm down from her emotional meltdown in front of the entirety of Ashford Academy. The sudden absence of her real mother and her obviously Hafu brother had simplified the details of that new mask wonderfully, simultaneously dispensing with loose ends while removing a temptation to hare away to Shinjuku instead of sticking it out in Ashford. That relief had melted away over the ensuing weeks and months as it became steadily more and more apparent to Callan that the dreaded investigation into her past by her new superior would never come. At first confused that the obvious social climber wasn't trying to force his way into her private life, Callan was annoyed and amused to discover that Major Pitt in fact had, only to crash face first into a sourced Lady Alicia Stadtfeld as full of fury as she was of gin. Sending the pain in the ass ROTC officer scampering had been perhaps the first and only kindness Callan's stepmother had ever done for her. Which makes me all the more certain that she only did it by accident. Callan didn't bother to suppress her smile at the thought. The idea of her two enemies tripping over one another and their respective agendas made the renewed loss of her mother sting a little bit less. We were doing so good too. After months of me treating her like shit, we were finally acting like a family again, at least behind closed doors. Callan pushed that thought away too and looked up from the path towards her destination. She was almost to the manor's front door, and Callan narrowed her eyes. She didn't recognize the black sedan parked out on the manor's driveway, nor the uniformed driver leaning against it and lighting a cigarette. The latter began to nod respectfully at her approach before he noticed the chevrons on her collar. Dropping his cigarette, the driver straightened to attention, his fist snapping to his chest in salute. No rank tabs on his uniform or any unit patches, Callan considered as she paused to return the salute before releasing it and taking another few steps closer. And he's saluting a sergeant? A cadet sergeant? There really isn't any need for that, you know, said Callan, hiking her rucksack back up over her shoulder. I'm just a cadet. What are you doing here? At ease, by the way. Begging your pardon, Sergeant, the man replied as he slipped into parade rest, but you're a cadet with a Nightmare Corps patch on your shoulder. Not all cadets are built the same, you know. Besides, red hair here? You've got to be a Stadtfeld. Respect where respect's due, you see. Aha, Callan nodded skeptically, already seeing another pit standing before her. Would that respect extend to answering the question I asked? Perhaps in addition to a follow-up, namely, who are you? I'm waiting until your Lord Father has finished his visit home to his loving wife and children, the driver answered, smirking as Callan's first spike of fury transmuted into confusion as she processed his response. As for who I am, that's really not important. The driver paused, before adding, were I you, I would not keep the old man waiting, Lady Callan. In his words, the jig is up. Best just to go in and take your lumps, that's my advice. With this last comment, the driver's initial amusement faded into something approaching sympathy. Callan didn't trust it, not when his eyes still danced with hidden laughter. But he's right, who he is doesn't matter. What does Dad know? Why? Why is he here? As a long list of potential discoveries the Baron of New Leicester could have made regarding her recent activities unspooled behind her eyes, Callan moved by impulse. Following the instincts hammered out over hours spent out on the former equestrian track turned ROTC training grounds, her heels snapped together and her fist rose to a parting salute. The unnamed driver smirked again but held his peace, fist rising lazily to bump against his chest again. Almost before the parting ritual was complete, Callan was turning back on her heel towards the manor. During her brief confrontation with the anonymous man with a soldier's bearing, someone had clearly spotted her and gone running to alert the household of her arrival. Now, Vernon, head butler of Stadtfeld Manor and her slut of a stepmother's barely secret lover, was waiting for her next to the open door, fat as butter and twice as greasy. There was an unsettling air of coordination about all of this, as if she had stumbled into the jaws of a trap when she'd passed through the ring of mulberries. Callan resisted the urge to turn and shoot a glare at the driver, certain she'd just find him smirking at her back, cigarette restored to its place between his fingers. Instead, still stinking of exertion and sweating freely from the summer's heat, Callan stalked forward up the short flight of stairs leading up to the manor's door. Lady Callan, Vernon greeted her, extending a hand as if she needed help up the stairs. PL. The breath rushed out of the majordomo as Callan shoved her rucksack forcefully into his chest. Why, thank you for offering to help with my bag, Vernon. Callan bared her teeth in an expression that could be called a smile. It's crammed full of laundry, so see to that too. Now, where are father and mother waiting? Let's get this over with. Tea the day parlour, Lady Callan, Vernon wheezed, to his credit still managing to stand up somewhat straight with one arm holding the door open and the other wrapped around her rucksack. They're waiting for you. So, no time to go change and freshen up, eh? Dad must be taking this seriously. Shit. The impulse to run away was almost as strong as the urge to seize this sudden threat by the throat. For a moment, Callan stood on the threshold of her family's house, torn between those two instincts. A third urging, to call Tanya or her big brother and request assistance, request orders, percolated up in between. Ruthlessly, Callan pushed each instinctual urge face down into a pool of water and held them down until the bubbles stopped. Or, at least, that was how she pictured the process as she closed her eyes and took deep, calming breaths, ignoring Vernon sidling around her and into the depths of the manor. Then, as the panic flowed out of her, Callan Stadtfeld opened her eyes. Her hands didn't twitch as she strode through the manor's atrium. When she turned left, down the hall towards the day parlor, her legs were steady as ancient cypress trees. It was only when her hand clasped the handle of the parlor door that her composure faltered slightly, an anxious tremor running through her limbs as Callan considered what could be waiting for her on the other side of that white-painted door. If he knows that I've joined the underground, that I am fighting for the liberation of Japan, I have no idea how Dad will react. It could go either of two ways, Callan thought. On the one hand, Alvin Stadtfeld had taken a Japanese lover and not abandoned her, not really, not like how Tanya's dad had. Also, someone had helped Naoto get his hands on that first batch of weapons. On the other hand, he's a Britannian noble. An enfeoffed lord. That means that he's loyal to the Empire, if perhaps not the Emperor himself. It was, Callan knew, entirely possible that she would walk into that parlor and find an entire squad of royal guard waiting to take her into custody, as befit her rank and her crimes. But what choice do I have? Calling Tanya is pointless, she can't help me now. Running away would just mean they'd shoot me in the back. Give me a coward's death. And that would not do. Not for Callan Stadtfeld and certainly not for Kozuki Callan. For the cause. Resolved, Callan turned the door handle and smoothly stepped into the day parlor. Anticlimactically, Callan found the room was entirely free of uniformed goons, save perhaps for herself. Instead, her father and her stepmother were sitting on separate couches on either side of a coffee table. A full tea service was laid out and each had a steaming cup perched on a saucer. Callan noted that the tasteful array of finger food accompaniments had been left entirely untouched. There was no desultory conversation to interrupt as she stepped through the parlor door. Indeed, there was no sign that either of the two adults present had noticed the presence of the either, except for the way their eyes seemed to skim over and through one another as Alvin, Baron of New Leicester, turned to greet his daughter and heir with an air of unmistakable relief. "Baron Alvin," said Callan, conscious that she was still in uniform as she took the initiative of breaking the instantly uncomfortable silence. Almost unbidden, her chin dipped as her hands found the edges of her skirt between thumb and forefinger. Then, in a single smooth motion, her right foot slipped behind her left, her hands gently spread to pull her uniform skirt flat across her thighs, and she dipped down, knees moving outwards as she genuflected before the patrician of House Stadtfeld. "Well met, Heiress Callan," her father replied, rising from the couch and turning towards her. Eyes the same blue as her own found hers, and the Baron's head dipped into a respectful nod, releasing her to straighten back up. "And now that I have greeted my heir as procedure demands." He spread his arms wide, his grey moustaches twitching above a spreading smile. "Why don't you come over and give your old man a hug, Callie?" On some reflex long buried from the time when she and Naoto had lived with their father and mother, a reflex that she'd never managed to fully snuff out, that was exactly what Callan did. "Hi Dad," she murmured, unable to even protest his use of her childhood nickname as she felt her father's strong arms wrap around her shoulders. "Good to see you." "It is a pleasure most fine to see you too, my dear Callie," Alvin replied, speaking into her hair as he pressed a whiskery kiss onto the top of her head. "No matter what else is going on. Honey, it will always be a damned fine pleasure to see you again." "And today?" "Oh, today, it has been far too long." Past her father, Callan could see Alicia continuing to stare straight ahead, through her husband and out the window behind him. "So?" Callan pulled back from the hug, looking up into her father's face. "What else is going on?" I'm really happy to see you too, she added quickly, before so much as a hint of disappointment could cross her father's face, but well, your driver said I should hurry up and take my lumps? And if the tension of waiting for the other shoe to drop continues on much longer, I think I'm going to scream. Ah, Errol. A look of amused pain stretched across Alvin's face, complete with a theatrical wince. Don't pay him too much mind, Callie. I've known him for years. He's not harmless, but he does love macking a mountain out of a hill of beans. Best just to nod along with whatever he says and then dial it all down about 10%. You say that, Dad, but you don't just take surprise trips across the Pacific. You rarely leave the homeland at all, and certainly not for some spontaneous jaunt to Japan. You came here for a reason, and don't think I didn't notice that you didn't deny the warning entirely. But Callan prompted, still waiting for the other boot to come crashing down. But nothing, Alvin Stadtfeld shrugged effortlessly. Like I said, honey bun, Errol just likes to give people a good fright. A reliable man, but a bit of a jokester, He chuckled, and for a second, some part of Callan could almost relax. However, I must say, I have heard the most wondrous things about how the geraniums are coming along this year, said Alvin, offering Callan a genial smile. Would you do your old man the courtesy of escorting him through the gardens, Callan? Behind him, Alicia remained stone-faced, still staring blankly out onto the view of the front lawn. By contrast, Alvin's smile seemed to Callan as pure as driven snow, as down-home and warm as biscuits fresh from the griddle. She couldn't find a hint of deceit in that smile, nor a single note of malicious intent in his tone. Indeed, by all appearances, he was nothing but a merry old father eager to take a walk with his daughter through a garden, no cunning machinations or sly traps to be found. Despite her father's overwhelmingly innocuous air, it was blatantly obvious what he meant, what he really wanted. In that moment, her inability to see past his amiable smile scared Callan more than standing at Millie Ashford's left hand, vulnerable before the leering eyes of the entire academy. Sure thing, Dad, she said, hoping that her smile held intact over the sudden fearful acceleration of her heart. That sounds like a great idea. As the two of them made their quiet way out of the day parlor and through the manor's back door, Callan noticed Vernon heading in the opposite direction. Judging by the way her father's eyes tracked the butler for a moment before dismissing him, he knew just as well as she did where he was going, and to whom. Neither Callan nor Alvin spoke until they were out on the grounds, surrounded by flowers, cicadas, and the oppressive, wet heat. Ah, just like being back home again, Alvin pronounced, rolling his shoulders as he stretched his arms out above his head. Minus the cicadas, of course, he amended. No broods in New Leicester, thank the Lord. Oh? Despite being the heiress to New Leicester, Callan could practically count the number of times she had set foot in the barony south of the Ohio River. She might be a Stadtfeld, but she'd never be a local in her family's ancient seat. That sounds nice. It must be nice to get a good night's sleep without all the bug sounds. Don't you worry about that, honey bun. The Smokies have their own variety of critters howling in the dark, Alvin smirked as he lowered himself to his haunches to examine some flower whose name Callan couldn't recall. I just happen to agree with the chatter of my old stomping grounds more than the local ensemble. That said, I think I'll always have a special affection for cicadas. They were chirping, you know, on the night your mother and I. Well. The greying Britannian looked up from the flower, his smirk softening into a simple smile as he looked at his daughter. You probably don't want to hear the rest of that story, but suffice it to say, cicadas will always have a place in my heart. Just as you will, Callie, you could stay here then, you know, Callan mumbled, abruptly feeling very young. It had been over a year since she had last seen her father, and so much had happened over that span. She'd published articles in real papers, even if they'd mostly been suppressed. She'd joined first an insurgency and then the inaugural cohort of Ashford Academy's ROTC. A year ago, she hadn't met Rivals and Lelouch, nor had she met Chihiro. She certainly hadn't met anybody like Tanya. A year ago, when she had last waved her father off at the airport, she hadn't killed, nor had anybody seriously tried to kill her. In so many ways, that Callan of a year ago had been so naive. "Your wife's here, after all," Callan added, glad that her voice sounded slightly stronger in her ears, not to mention Mom. "Nathan'd be happy to see you too, I bet. You don't have to go back there." Oh, what I wouldn't give to live in a world like that, Honeybun." A breath too soft to be a sigh escaped his lips like the last breath of a dying man as Alvin's smile turned somber, almost melancholic. "Regretful. Unfortunately, the real world is not so kind. And as the old Japanese imperial swords were so fond of saying, duty is heavier than a mountain," Callan quoted by rote, having heard that line far too many times. Her gut twisted as she remembered all the times she had heard it, and from whose mouths it had come. Her father had said it before he left her, and Naoto had said it before he vanished into Shinjuku. Tanya had said some variation of it in her hearing at least half a dozen times. She was so tired of hearing about duty. She supposed that was part of the mountain. "That it is, Callie, that it is," Alvin hummed non-committally. "Although, speaking of duty, tell me about your cadet program." Callan could see something in her father's bearing shift. A kind of energy seemed to be creeping out from some inner reserve, seeping from every pore of his bones and pushing the melancholy out in favor of something that set her teeth on edge. "Is this ROTC, led by Major Pitt?" A faint hint of a sneer touched his face before fading back into his genial smile. "Everything you feared it would be?" "Yes. And no," admitted Callan, eyes on her father's back as he dusted his hands off and stood back up. "I mean, don't get me wrong, Pitt's still a complete pig of a man. He's just so obvious, you know. He keeps complimenting me all the time and tells all the other cadets they should be just like me, but I feel like he's saying that because I'm watching, and he knows I'm watching?" She took a breath. "Does that make sense?" "Oh, entirely, Honeybun," Alvin nodded, straightening up and knuckling his back. Don't get old, Callan, I promise you it isn't worth it. But, yes, men of the good Major's ilk are common as dirt and half as useful. Be polite and respectful to him, but keep your distance, and never, ever accept a favor from him, that's my advice. What about your fellow cadets? If they're the cream of Britannian nobility, I have no idea how we all escaped the fate of the French, Callan said, dismissing her entire cohort as one. Half of them are just miniature Pits too. My, I see you have inherited your mother's sharp tongue to go with her enchanting beauty, Alvin chuckled fondly. But I would not be so quick to dismiss the sons and daughters of Britannia. Your fellow cadets might be as green as the forest's leaves, but their families survived the emblem of blood where many other noble lines did not. Do not let their inexperience blind you to the threat they present. I'm not, Callan replied shortly. Don't worry, Dad, I'm not going to forget that they're a threat, they're Britannians. In case you have forgotten, my dear, as are you. And unlike your fellow cadets, you have already proven yourself a true lioness in waiting, or perhaps a cub. Maybe it's time you set about making yourself a pride, Alvin pointed out. Callan remained stubbornly silent and tried not to think about the implication. The Britannian flag, after all, featured a lion prominently on its crest. Eventually, he sighed. Well, it breaks my heart to hear that you haven't made any friends yet among the ranks. What about the rest of your school? You are on the student council now, aren't you, and weren't you with the newspaper club before? Find any new friends there? Not really, Callan admitted. Not in the newspaper club. Nobody else really took it seriously, except for a few of the girls, who took investigating Lelouch a bit too seriously. She rolled her eyes. Seriously. As if we didn't have anything better to report on. I blame Millie, her influence has scrambled the entire Academy's sensibilities. Lelouch? Baron Alvin, Lord Stadtfeld inquired, the curious smile on his lips growing fixed. I didn't realize that the murder of the lost prince had become such a captivating topic of interest for schoolyard news clubs. What? Callan blinked and then remembered the fate of the vice president's namesake. Oh, no, nothing so interesting. Or dangerous. No, the student council vice president happens to be named after the prince. Lots of boys that age are, you know. For some reason, lots of the other girls like him. But not you? As Callan had explained the name, Alvin's smile relaxed into a teasing expression. I'll point out that he's the first boy I've heard about from you so far, Callie. Or, perhaps Millie's the one who I should be speaking with after I'm done here? Dad. Callan yelped, before noticing the smile and huffing. No, I'm not interested in either of them. But, she added grudgingly, they aren't that bad, Millie's. Millie gives me a headache, but after the assembly she realized she'd overstepped and apologized. Well, honestly, it was Lelouch who probably told her that she'd overstepped, and was the one to deliver her apology. And he's the one who's helped keep her under control at council meetings since then. He's been helpful. Alvin hummed again, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet as his eyes raked the flower beds before turning to catch Callan again. So, is this Lelouch boy your hacker friend, Callan? Suppressing her shock took all of Callan's practice at concealing her emotions behind a pleasant mask. As ice water filled her veins, Callan's expression didn't flicker. This is it, Tanya's cool voice pronounced behind her eyes. The other shoe has fallen. But, while it's impossible to know how he learned of Lelouch's edits to your file, it is possible that those edits are the extent of his knowledge. Keep your cover. My hacker friend? Callan met her father's questioning look with an inquisitively raised eyebrow of her own. I don't know what you're talking about, Dad. Lelouch is pretty skilled with computers, I guess, but the real computer was on the student council is definitely Nina. Shirley's the treasurer, but I think she pushes her work off onto Nina. Probably for the best. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the alterations made to your file, Callan? Alvin asked, clearly unimpressed with his daughter's attempt at a smokescreen. His blue eyes, suddenly cold, hammered against Callan's composure. What kind of fool do you think that I am, to not leave tripwires on your files? I was notified the moment someone tampered with your Ministry of Justice file. Besides, that file was locked and only a handful of people had the clearance necessary to edit it, much less access it. So, yes, your hacker friend. My Ministry of Justice file? The earth wobbled under Callan's feet. She was suddenly very light-headed. Her right hand, she realized, was inching towards the knife concealed in her compact. She grasped her hands together to stop it, and to hide the sudden unnerving tremble. Not the Ministry of Education? Why? She swallowed. Why would the Ministry of Justice have a file on me? Because of my articles? The knowing look in her father's eyes was terrifying. The realization that she had just tipped her cards and revealed her hand even more so. Tamaki was right. Callan thought miserably, I'm really not cut out for these spy games. Damn it, Naoto. Damn it, Tanya. And damn you, Lelouch. You and your fucking peace offering. I knew I should have stabbed you when I had the chance. Then, another thought crossed her mind. Wait. She peered suspiciously at Alvin Stadtfeld, Baron of New Leicester. Why would you know if the Ministry of Justice had a file on me? How could you have had any sort of alerts about changes made to its setup? Another question bubbled horribly up from the depths of her mind, like gas rising from the bottom of a bog. Dad. You. The driver called you the old man, but you're not Army, are you? I'll be asking the questions, I think. His grey Van Dyke moustache twitched upwards, but the smile below was anything but amused. Starting with Naoto and Hitomi's locations. Interesting that you brought up your mother and brother earlier, Callan, and invited me to join them when both seemed to have vanished completely. I left your mother in a safe position here at the manor. Where did you put her? I don't know. This time, Callan didn't need to bother with any emotional masks. I haven't seen her in months. I've got no idea where she is. Her protestation did not put her father at ease. And your brother? I know you visited Shinjuku quite often, although you stopped dropping by for a few months at the start of the year before resuming in April. Then, you suddenly stopped visiting the ghetto at the same time your file was edited and your mother spirited away. Should I assume that you know nothing of your brother's location either? No, Callan ground out, her panic quickly transmuting to anger as it always did. It was much easier to be angry than it was to be afraid. I've got no idea where he ran off to. But, she allowed, taking a deep breath and remembering that this was still her father, her dad she was speaking to. I think he and Mom are together. I don't know where they are, but they're supposed to be safe. For a moment, Alvin Stadtfeld said nothing. His eyes, distant and unsympathetic, picked over her face. Callan could almost feel those eyes peeling her back, layer by layer, and wondered if she had ever known her father after all. She had never seen that look before. Not on his face, at least. Can I assume, Alvin said, venturing the question in a tone suggesting that the answer had better be as the asker expected, that they are supposed to be safe in some place that is quite far away from Yokohama? Callan couldn't have said what it was that gave him away, but she was suddenly cognizant of the way her father was holding himself, the way his hands were tucked behind his back, out of sight, and the way his face was so artificially flat and void of emotion. She recognized that expression immediately. She'd seen it often enough in the mirror. So that's why you came, Callan thought, a sudden wave of bitter disappointment crashing over her head. I should have guessed. You don't have to worry, she replied, her voice barely above a hiss, her fragmented composure shivering like drops of water on a hot stove. The only Japanese woman you need care about is fine and, as far as I know, completely safe. Thousands aren't, but that's not what matters, is it? For a moment, Alvin's eyes glimmered with emotion. Then, he took a deep breath, and the glimmer snuffed out like a candle flame. That's good, he replied, his words terse but unmistakably relieved. That's good. And your brother is as well, I take it, as you said that they are together? That's very good. Silently, Callan nodded. Yes, it was good that her mother and brother weren't among the thousands of murdered Japanese piled up on Yokohama's street corners. On that much, she could agree. That much, she could concede. No more. Would you? Alvin licked his lips, a quick, darting motion. A crack in the smooth mask, a vision of the man within. Would you pass a message to them? Assuming you have some way to contact them, of course. No need to tell me what that way is, he added quickly, and no need to confirm. Just, if you can manage it, I would consider it a personal favor. Callan nodded again, pointedly noncommittal. After all, she thought vindictively, he's the one asking the questions, isn't he? Besides, she reasoned, I'm not even sure if I can get a message out to them. I'd have to wait until Rivals comes in for a student council meeting and pass a message to him without Lelouch or Millie seeing it. Get him to hand it over to Inno, and hopefully she'll know someone who can get it to Naoto or Mom. And Tanya did say I should only do that for emergencies, and since Mom's safe. Does this really count? Something of that last thought must have flashed across her face, as seeing it, her father nodded resignedly. If you can see your way clear, he added, I would appreciate it. But, if not. He waved vaguely. Now, he continued, clearly letting the topic go, I know that you're not in the most cooperative mood at the moment, Callan, but please set aside your anger for a moment. I still need a bit more information from you. Please. Again, Callan met her father's eyes. They were imploring, but not desperate. Not like they had been in that one moment, where Alvin Stadtfeld's concern for her mother, his lover, had shown through. Still. They were her dad's eyes. And Naoto trusts him. All right, Callan said, exhaling her anger as best she could and trying to find Callan the journalist in her head, pushing Kozuki Callan, Callan Stadtfeld, and, most of all Callie, out of her way. What do you want to know? You seem really well informed already, so I don't see what I can tell you, but ask away. Well, to start with, Alvin began, one hand emerging from behind his back to idly play with his narrow beard, What are your thoughts on the death of the Yokohama sniper? What are your thoughts about the establishment of a new branch office of the EB in the Hiroshima settlement? The sniper? Callan's lip curled. Good damned riddance. It was the least she wanted to say about the late and very much unlamented Tanaka Chihiro. Just a pity she brought so many people down with her. And the same goes for the ones who brought her down, Callan continued, shaking her head. I mean, the EB. I'm not sure what they're hoping to do, setting up shop here in Area 11. I mean, it's not like there's a lack of police running around, and the DIS is supposed to be keeping everybody working under the viceregal governor's decree, so. Callan allowed her words to taper off with an artless shrug. Her eyes never left her father's face. She might not be the best spy, much to her irritation, but she hadn't been a half-bad rookie reporter. At least, not in her own opinion. Diethard Reed might scoff at her work, but he'd still read it, which was something in and of itself. Her few months of finding stories that the administration hadn't wanted people to know about the treatment of the honoraries and the exploitation by the nobility of everybody else in the area, had given her at least a few instincts. Every one of which was telling her that her father knew much more about the situation than he was telling. And perhaps by feigning disinterest, he might take it upon himself to educate his daughter. Judging by the flash of amusement in Alvin Stadtfeld's eyes, he wasn't taken in for a second. Still, he couldn't seem to hold himself back. You don't think the EB establishing a presence in Area 11 will change anything, do you? He shook his head sadly. Callan. It's all about using the correct tool for the job at hand. You wouldn't use a spanner to. He checked himself, remembering his audience. You wouldn't use a nightmare to attack a naval vessel, would you? That's the wrong tool for the job. Oh? Callan cocked her head to the side, interested despite herself. So, what job is the directorate supposed to be doing? I remember seeing something about them uncovering corruption in the judiciary. Above all else, the directorate handles issues internal to His Imperial Majesty's administration, Alvin confirmed with a nod and just a hint of a wry smile. At least, they handle all the issues that they themselves don't cause. Broadly speaking, the DIS are tasked with hunting down traitors in the lesser and petty nobilities, the upper ranks of the civil service, commoners over a certain level of wealth and influence, and the officer corps. But not the greater nobility, Callan pressed, noting the absence. So, they wouldn't bother us? Oh, they wouldn't dare, Alvin chuckled, but that has nothing to do with our title. We're barely greater nobles. Country barons are very much in the DIS remit. Really, anybody without a ducal tiara or a bishop's mitre is their rightful prey. Excepting the imperial family, of course, Callan parroted, noting the way her father's words trailed off into an unspoken but nevertheless clear and less. So, in that case, what does the EB do? Ah, that's the right question, said Alvin, beaming with pride. It took Nathan a while to remember to ask me that one. The Bureau, like the Directorate, is tasked with hunting traitors and criminals to His Imperial Majesty. Unlike the DIS, the Bureau focuses on the lower strata of commoners, honoraries, and numbers. I see, acknowledged Callan, speaking slowly as she turned the new information over in her mind. Isn't that what the night police is for, though? Surely another group setting up here will make everybody already here upset. The night police. Alvin didn't even bother trying to hide his contempt. Oh, the night police. I have so much sympathy for the poor fools in the actual military police who have to put up with that blunt instrument. The night police. The greying lord shook his head, smiling to himself. No, Callan, the night police won't make a peep. They're a tool here, not a player. The Directorate, on the other hand, will be quite upset. But the Bureau stole a march on them by bagging the sniper, so if Director Rankin has any sense, he'll keep his powder dry for now. Does this mean that the DIS and EB might start going after each other? Callan tried to keep from sounding too interested in the answer. Judging by the look her father shot her, she failed. I mean, she hurriedly added, the regular soldiers and the purists got into a massive brawl back around last Christmas, and there's practically a brawl every other day down by the docks between off-duty soldiers or Marines from the line regiments and the ones from the Purists' troops. Ah yes, Alvin shook his head, a moue of disgust curling across his lip. Garrison troops. And Purists. He snorted again. Bastards should have taken the hint back in the 80s. But, he cleared his throat, you aren't wrong. There is likely to be a degree of conflict between the EB and the DIS, but unless it is truly amateur hour, it won't be so obvious. However, the Bureau's newest field office should signal a shift in strategy, as far as intelligence gathering in Area 11 goes. A greater focus on the numbers, a lighter focus on the upper crust. For better or worse. And, is this all the sniper's fault? Callan asked, silently damning Chihiro's ghost to an even deeper hell. I mean, she was just one woman, right? Some crazy murderer with a rifle? Is that enough to cause a strategic change? Not on its own, Alvin replied placidly, but never underestimate the power of a nice, bloody shirt. Sometimes, Britannians do far more in His Imperial Majesty's service as convenient corpses than they ever could have accomplished in a lifetime of service, but leaving aside the capital the Bureau gained by ending the Yokohama snipers' reign of terror, something along these lines has certainly been in the making for a while. At least since the troubles back in the spring. The grey moustache quirked back up into a smile. Someone's running out of patience for Prince Clovis, I think. I see. Callan nodded her understanding. Yeah, that sounds plausible. I see that this is information that Naoto and Tanya really need to know, Callan thought as she babbled, filling time. I don't think we've got anything going on all the way down by Hiroshima, but if we don't, we really should. If the Bureau really is that good, we can't let them get set up here in Japan. Yes, Lord Stadtfeld nodded back to her. Do make sure Nathan hears all about that. Make sure his friends hear about that too. If I were you, I would tell all of them, Nathan most especially, to crawl into the deepest holes they can find and to close the doors behind them. For their sake, and for yours. This is not a battle he should want to fight, not if he can avoid it. Whatever business he has outstanding, tell him to bring it to a speedy conclusion as soon as he can. For a second time, the earth swayed under Callan's feet. Damn it! She raged inside her head, staggering back a step from the Britannian in front of her. I got so engrossed in the topic that I completely forgot. No, I just thought the hacking thing was all he was here for, that and Mom. He knows. Yes, a cooler voice in her head agreed, he knows. And what will you do about it, Kozuki Callan? Anything for the cause. Anything? Almost all of Callan revolted at the thought, Kozuki Callan and Callan Stadtfeld agreeing unreservedly for once with Kelly. But that's Dad. Our dad. Almost all of her agreed. He's old and slow, that same cool voice said. His back hurts. Look at his knuckles, they're swollen and arthritic. And we have a knife. It would only take one swift move, just a single slice across the neck. We've got the strength for it. It would be over in an instant, and he wouldn't be able to tell anybody else about us. That's stupid, thought Kozuki Callan, and you know it's stupid. What the hell comes next, huh? What do we do with the body? With our clothes covered in blood? How the fuck does killing Dad help the cause, huh? That, thought Callan Stadtfeld with Britannian cruelty, sounds like something Chihiro would do, doesn't it? All fury, without the least bit of thought. With a terrific wrench, Kozuki Callan forced it all to the back of her mind and lifted her eyes back to meet her father's. All she saw there was disappointment. No anger, no fear, no confusion. It was painfully obvious that Alvin Stadtfeld had read the course of her thoughts without her needing to vocalize a thing. It sent a pang through her belly, that disappointment. The cool voice slunk away. How long? Callan ground out, not noticing until the words were out that she had defaulted to Japanese. How long have you known about them? At the last second, she caught herself and used the ambiguously inclusive term. After all, there's no guarantee that he knows about Ogi and Inno, much less Tanya. When I gave Naoto the seed money and contacts he requested, Alvin replied in the same language, his Japanese slightly rusty at first but quickly gaining steam. I had assumed that he would be starting a criminal enterprise of his own, and would carve his own way to power in the ghettos and villages of Japan. I could not give him his true inheritance, the lordship of New Leicester, so I gave him the means to create his own lordship, after the manner of other half-Britannians who couldn't quite pass. His moustache twitched up over an undeniably proud smile. Ah, a chip off the old block, I thought. The smile faded. So, imagine my surprise when I started getting notifications that you, Callan, had begun visiting the ghetto with increasing regularity. At first, I was more than happy to let you continue. After all, the imperial family aside, siblings should remain close, if at all possible. And the last traces of amusement vanished. And he was there for you when I couldn't be. Who was I to step between you and your brother? I wasn't there when you needed me to be, and I didn't want to make things worse between us by interfering any further. Words caught behind Callan's teeth. What words? She couldn't quite say. Agreement that Alvin, her father, hadn't been there to stop the childhood bullies. Protestations that she wanted him to be involved with her life. A rebuke to say that he was right to stay far away. But then, Alvin continued, Christmas came, complete with its little pogrom. I began to worry, especially when you started trying your hand at journalism, of all things. He shook his head, with almost an admiring look of disbelief stamped across his face. Never let it be said that Naoto is the rebellious one of my children. But, Christmas came, and I grew worried, especially when the notifications suddenly ceased. And then, in 2 days, you called me about Pitt and all of the tripwires I had guarding your files went off as one. You have no idea how badly you scared me, Callan. Her father's eyes were locked on hers. Lord Stadtfeld temporarily dismissed in favor of Alvin. Dad. Calling me like that early? You never call me, and then I get a sudden call about some major harassing you? I thought. He sighed and ran a hand over his pointed beard. Well, never mind what I thought. You were more nervous than a teen approached by an army recruiter should be. So, he smiled grimly, I started wondering what had made you so nervous to receive official attention, albeit from a major. And wouldn't you know it, Alvin's rant had taken on an almost avalanche proportion, a mix of long-suppressed professional and personal stresses finally given voice. As soon as I started looking, I understood entirely why you were so worried. Naoto has done quite well for himself, hasn't he? I can't tell you how surprised I was to learn that the Kozuki organization had taken over an entire city, all under the administration's nose, practically within sight of the viceregal palace. A look of acute pain passed over the man's face. Why my idiot son chose to name his clandestine rebel organization after himself, I will never understand. Both his mother and I are far too smart for that. But you are arrogant enough, Callan shot back, before forcing her mouth closed, her teeth clicking together. Damn it, Callan. Her father shot her a quelling look, but then barked with harsh laughter. Perhaps, he sighed again. I am quite proud of him. I certainly hadn't anticipated that. I do wish he hadn't felt it necessary to all but declare war on His Imperial Majesty, though. And, Alvin sighed again, I wish he had been brave enough to turn you away and insist you keep your nose well out of it. Perhaps I really should have come back for longer earlier. Even a few years earlier. Only seeing you two for a weekend a year. Alvin shook his head, an expression of resigned weariness clear to see. You make me proud, both of you, but I really should have kept a closer eye on the pair of you. On you in particular, Callan. A long, quiet moment passed between them. Alvin's pent-up emotions seemed spent. Callan felt unsteady and uncertain of where they stood. The mulberries surrounding them moaned and creaked, shaken by the wind. Well, Callan finally got out as the silence grew unbearably heavy, what will you do? Now that you know what I've been up to, what Naoto's been up to. Are you our dad first? Or Baron Alvin Stadtfeld to the core? God knows, replied Alvin, his breath exploding out in a heavy sigh. What do you think I should do, Callan? What would you do if you learned that not one but both of your children had involved themselves in a war against an empire that controls 40% of the Earth's surface? I would back them to the hilt, Callan replied immediately. What other option would I have? Throw them onto the Emperor's grace? Last time I checked, the only punishment allowable for a finding of treason is execution by the wheel. If the choice is going to war against that empire or watching my children's limbs being broken and wound around the spokes of a cartwheel, well, is that any choice at all? Alvin closed his eyes, sighed, and let his head fall backwards. His lips moved soundlessly for a moment, and Callan wondered if he was praying. Then, he reopened his eyes and glared irritably down at her. You know, he began, his tone pointedly bland, when I learned that you had chosen to sign up with the ROTC even after I extended an offer to drive Pitt away, I was truly hoping that this was a sign of maturity. I see that I was overly optimistic. Maturity? Callan hissed incredulously. I can be plenty mature. I am a model cadet, I will have you know, and I have yet to lose my temper even once. And I have been tempted. Yes, said Alvin, waving her words away. Very impressive. Tell me, Callan, why is it that you stubbornly refuse to use your brain? You are an incredibly intelligent young lady, and I am proud of you, so it truly hurts me to see you act in such a deliberately stupid fashion. Almost snorting with anger, Callan opened her mouth, mentally rolling up her sleeves for a full-contact brawl with this Britannian who dared to tell her how she should think. And paused. This wasn't some Brit bastard, this was Dad. He only wants the best for us, Callan. She could almost hear Naoto's non-explanation, repeated so many times over the years. Deep breaths. Act in deliberation, not out of impulse. Tanya's advice was more useful. In and out. In and out. Breathe in, hold. Release. All right, Callan said, meeting her father's eyes as she mimicked his flat tone. You clearly want me to say something. I clearly don't know what it is. Can we stop with the Socratic method and skip ahead to the part where you tell me what I should be thinking? Callan. Alvin paused, and Callan could almost watch as he mapped out his path through the conversation to whatever objective he had in mind. Not for the first time, she wondered who, exactly, her father was. I don't object to your determination or your resolve, he said, cushioning his statement, but you are far too prone to a binary mode of thinking. Us versus them, right versus wrong, etc. In truth, very little in life is as cleanly cut as all that. Take, for instance, the divide between Britannian and Japanese. You hate Britannia, but you have friends who are Britannian, don't you? You love Japan and the Japanese, but surely you have encountered bastards who speak your mother tongue? There can be good Britannians and bad Japanese, and already that clear division between good and bad begins to blur on anecdotal experience alone. Sure, there's assholes everywhere, Callan interrupted with deliberate crudeness. But that doesn't mean that Britannia isn't evil. Callan. Alvin looked increasingly pained. Please, just listen, all right? There's a good girl. Now, binary thinking is comfortable and easy, it will also lead you to incorrect conclusions. Now, I am a Britannian, by birth and by upbringing. Yet I gave Naoto, my son, my money and my blessing to go forth and undermine His Imperial Majesty's law in Area 11. When I did this, it was not treason. If Naoto had been arrested before he became a rebel, I could have easily removed him from the cells and his arrest from the record. This is because us and them only exist so far as both blocks can remain coherent. As soon as you find leverage into the individuals or the factions below the giant defining masks, understandings can be worked out. Agreements can be made. Blackmail and bribes trade hands. You're not answering your own question, Callan pointed out. You asked what I thought you should do with me, and you're just rambling on about philosophy. Her father gave her a dirty look but sighed. Fine. Callan, you clearly cannot remain unsupervised. As your father, I find myself obligated to intervene for your own protection. For some reason, I cannot protect Naoto from his own stupidity, and I would have better luck taking over the Fuji Special District than I would prying Hitomi away from her son. You, however, I can keep safe from the worst consequences of your own rash decisions. You can't stop me. Callan didn't spit defiance, it was the simple truth. I will never stop fighting for Japan. I am not Britannian, not where it counts. What makes you think I want you to stop fighting? Alvin smiled, a hard-edged thing that gleamed with friendly malice. For that matter, what makes you think that I want you to stop fighting Britannians? Again, Callan, it isn't a matter of us and them, it's a matter of us, with them being a fluid category for whoever isn't us at this very moment. And in Area 11, the Japanese are the least of the Empire's concerns. His moustache twitched at some private joke. Consider it a favor, from a patriarch to his heir, that I shall be providing you the tools to serve His Imperial Majesty's interests without shedding a drop of Japanese blood. What? Callan frowned, finding that the conversation had turned in her hands like a snake, and now she was the one on the back foot. What do you mean? How could I possibly help Britannia and not be abandoning the Japanese? Your whole damned empire is fighting the Japanese. Britannia isn't fighting the Japanese, Alvin scoffed. The Japanese aren't worth fighting. It'd be like saying exterminators fight rats, or that gardeners fight weeds. They don't. His Highness might like to describe the occupation as a matter of life and death for the health of the empire, but not on account of the Japanese. No, his real concern is the Chinese or the Europeans taking advantage of the chaos to stick their own oars into our pond, and even with that in mind his reports seethe with hyperbole. So no, the administration isn't fighting the Japanese, they are simply conducting pest control operations. The dismissive words tore at Callan's heart, and from the wounds bubbling rage seeped. Face twisted, she opened her mouth, although what she could say in refutation was anybody's guess, but already her father was holding up a hand to forestall her. I am not saying that the Japanese are vermin, mind you, nor am I saying that Naoto's efforts are destined for failure. I'm simply saying that the locals are too weak to give the army the proper, stand-up fight for which they hunger. The kind that brings glory and recognition instead of drudgery. Those confrontations are like catnip to a certain strain of military mind, all simple and straightforward and proper. The insurgents present an adversary of sorts, an obstacle certainly, but Japan isn't a proper enemy, not one worth their full attention. I don't understand, Callan admitted, feeling the spike of rage peter away into something like grief at her father's frank assessment. Good, good. Alvin praised, bobbing his head approvingly. Admitting as much is the first step. He's trying to teach me something. Callan knew that much already, but what is the lesson here? That Britannia isn't united? That's obvious, with the purists running around. That the real threat is a foreign invasion? I suppose, but the Chinese are too busy being pushed up the Malay Peninsula and out of Indochina, and if the news isn't complete bullshit, the EU is desperately trying to prop up the Middle Eastern Federation facing Cornelia's invasion. So, who is the real enemy in Area 11, then? And how does he know all about this? Again, who are you, Dad? You know far, far too much. But, Alvin continued, that is only the first step. Drawing himself up to his full height, a weight seemed to settle over her father's shoulders as he peered down at her. Callan met him look for stony look, still uncertain about all her father had said but determined not to submit. Baron Alvin of New Leicester smiled as he folded his hands neatly behind his back. Moving forwards, Lady Callan, I will be overseeing your training. For the next few months at least. To be clear, this isn't a punishment, nor is it entirely a corrective measure. I have neglected my duties as head of House Stadtfeld and as your father for far too long. There is much that I should have taught you by now, but I was always busy. This ends here. It was everything Callan had wished for years, delivered at the most inopportune time. Well, I'm busy now, Callan retorted, savagely pushing down Callie and her sudden eagerness for time with Dad. You were too late, and now I have my obligations to tend to. For starters, She gestured at her stinking uniform. I'm a cadet, sworn to the army. My days aren't my own. Major Pitt doesn't have the spine to stand in the way of a father-daughter outing, Lord Statfeld asserted, eyes cold. Men desperate enough to bait in teenagers in service of supporting their decrepit careers are generally locked into those careers for excellent reason, most often a gratuitous lack of competency, a gratuitous abundance of cowardice, or both. Well, I still need to learn how to pilot a nightmare, let alone how to be a good soldier of the Empire, Callan shot back, and wondered why she was pushing back so hard against this. How the hell are you going to train me to be a pilot or a soldier when, to my knowledge, you've never been either? Pilots can be purchased, Lord Statfeld riposted. Like practically everything in this world, skilled individuals are available for sale, should the buyer have the correct currency in the necessary amount. He's not giving up, Callan realized wonderingly. New Leicester isn't exactly rich either, and pilots skilled enough to teach don't grow on trees. But if he's willing to throw around cash on this, maybe I could convince him to buy a simulator too? Or even a real, actual nightmare. Alvin's lips parted in a smile and Callan cursed herself, certain that her father had, once again, read her thoughts like words on a page. That really must be corrected as well, Lord Statfeld pointed out. No peer of the realm should be so easily read. You might be tolerable, barely, as a provincial schoolgirl, but as the heiress to a homeland barony, well. Failing grade, I'm afraid. I'm not getting out of this, Callan thought, a numb sense of horror mixed with a strange relief, almost a joy, suffusing her limbs. Can't escape to Ashford without Pitt sending me back, can't escape to Shinjuku without breaking Tanya's orders. Can't stay here, not with a drunken hag. So, Callan tried for a perky smile, as if she hadn't just knuckled under her father's persistent demands. Some father-daughter bonding time, huh? Sounds. Well, what do you have in mind? The bastard smiled. Oh, I was thinking about an educational trip, for a start. After all, if you want to be a nightmare pilot, I would say that you owe yourself a trip to Itsukushima. It could be quite valuable for you to visit the site of the only defeat suffered by Britannian nightmares at the Japanese hands, wouldn't you agree? And, said Callan, something like understanding finally entering her mind as some of her father's earlier words sank in at last. What's the real reason we're going to Itsukushima, Dad? That's my girl, Alvin laughed, his baronial authority fleeing at once. Why, that's just on the other side of Hiroshima Bay from where the new bureau office is being established in the Hiroshima settlement. It would be rude not to drop by and offer my congratulations to the opposition, now that they've finally entered the game in Area 11. May 10, 2016 ATB. Student Council Clubhouse, Ashford Academy, Tokyo Settlement. 2300. Hello, Nunnally, the warm presence she knew to be her brother said, lowering himself into the chair beside her bed, which creaked under the familiar weight, just as it had for years now. I apologize for keeping you up so late. I expected you back an hour ago at the latest, brother, said Nunnally Lamperouge, once Nunnally Vi Britannia, daughter of Marianne the Flash and the man who had remade Britannia in his own image, and now nothing, clasping her big brother's offered hand. I was beginning to worry. It was cool and dry, that hand, with skin that had roughened ever so slightly over the last few weeks. Long-fingered and as clever as the mind of its master, the hand turned over in hers to wrap its fingers around her own thin digits. His welcoming squeeze was soft, gentle. She returned the squeeze with all of her strength, built up on the rare occasions she practiced with the manual wheelchair reserved for emergencies. Despite mustering up every scrap of pressure that she could, Nunnally could barely equal her famously unathletic brother's grip strength. Weak. I'm sorry, brother repeated, and Nunnally knew that he was sorry, both by the way the air currents shifted as he ducked his head slightly and by the way his voice trailed off into the breathy sigh that only emerged when he apologized sincerely. She believed him, he was always sorry when he left her behind. At least, once he realized that he had left her behind. Not that it ever stopped him. Nothing ever stopped him. Unlike her. Broken. I forgive you, she said, just as she always did. What other choice did she have? Sayoko said that she would save some dinner for you. You can make up for keeping me from my beauty sleep by eating it, no skipping meals, Lelouch. Sayoko and Millie say you're not eating enough and are getting too thin. Orienting her face toward the direction of his voice, Nunnally frowned ferociously and, when he chuckled, tried to smile at his amusement. Pathetic. Why were you out so late? She asked, channeling into that question some of the ever-present frustration that always threatened to swallow her whole. It's one thing for you to spend your Fridays and weekends gambling, Lelouch, but this is a school night. I had special dispensation from the highest of authorities, brother said, and Nunnally could hear in his voice the smile she hadn't seen in years. After all, Madam President herself accompanied me, so surely I could do no wrong. You went out with Millie? Curiosity flooded Nunnally, along with a hunger to hear more. In her bubble of carefully guarded peace, invigorating stimulation was a rarity. I hope you were every inch the gentleman, brother. Of course I was. Brother replied, before adding a moment later, after all, I was out taking in a trivia night with my fiancé on my arm, how could I be on anything but my best behavior? Lost time. Losing time. A central theme of the recurring nightmare that had plagued Nunnally for years. In her dream, she woke up old and grey in her bed, still blind, still broken. Sometimes her brother was still there, sitting by her side, his hand in hers, telling her sweet lies as he had when they were children. Sometimes he was still there, still holding her hand, but his flesh was cold and clammy, and she was too frail to push his corpse away as it collapsed forwards onto her, pinning her against the bed that had been her prison for years. Worst of all were the dreams when she woke in darkness, old and grey, and found that her beloved brother wasn't there. When she dreamed that he had left her long ago, as he should have done long ago, to live his own life. To find a woman to love and another few to bear his children, just like their father had done, and had left her behind like a forgotten childhood toy. A ragdoll, button eyes gone and legs shredded, left to gather dust. Nunnally had never told her brother about those dreams, first because she feared putting the idea in his head, then because she realized that she only wanted to tell him about her fears because it would bind him to her ever tighter. The fact that she knew as much made the temptation all the sweeter, but Nunnally loved her brother. She would never do anything to hurt him, most especially not anything that would convince him to throw away his whole life just to burden himself with her pathetic simulacrum of living. Still, it was easy to make a commitment to suffer in silence when Nunnally knew with a childlike certainty that had long since outlived her childhood, that her brother was still there, would always still be there. Actually hearing him refer to another woman, a woman that he would always be there for, sent ice water racing through her veins. She swallowed her panic and ignored the cold dread that gripped her heart. I didn't know you had proposed at last, brother. Congratulations on your upcoming nuptials. Thank you, dear sister, brother replied jovially, and Nunnally relaxed as she heard the joke in his voice. Honestly, he sighed, remind me to never again grant Millie free rein to invent her backstory. And no, you don't need to worry about her virtue, or mine, we found God, you see. What? Nunnally couldn't even muster a witty response to that apparent non sequitur. Her heart was still beating rabbit quick after the fright brother had inadvertently tossed her way. I am sorry, brother, could you kindly elaborate? Well, perhaps not God, her brother conceded, but perhaps the next best thing. It started with a strange piece of street art I saw a few days back, you see. So Nunnally lay in silence, a captive audience in her own bed. Though she would have happily listened to her brother tell stories of a world she could barely remember seeing, all the same, had she any choice in the matter. She cooed appreciatively in all the right spots and gasped appropriately when he revealed the identity of the strange group of heretics. Providing an attentive and appreciative audience was the least she could do for her brother, the only thanks she could afford to give him for allowing her to vicariously experience a side of the world her infirmities and his love would never allow her to see through his stories. It's so unfair, an ungrateful, resentful part of her moaned, and Nunnally couldn't help but agree. All brother has to do is walk down an alleyway to find a mysterious society of hidden heretics. All he has to do is listen to an old man ramble and murmur a few platitudes to become a leader in their midst. I listen all the time and murmur platitudes, but nobody gives me anything but condescending headpats. If I had his luck, his life, I would put it to far better use than brother ever could. That thought Nunnally pushed back into the dark, along with all of the other evil, useless thoughts. It was crowded, in that darkness, but there would be time enough in the long hours of the night for those shameful and shamefully satisfying thoughts. For now, her brother wanted his sweet Nunnally, all innocent and pure and forgiving. If he knew the least part of what I thought to myself, brother would never hold my hand again. Speaking of brother, he had fallen silent, and Nunnally realized he was waiting for her to say something. "Well, brother," she said, rewinding through the last moments of half-heard story as she beamed brilliantly at the place she knew her brother filled in the endless dark, "it truly is a treat to hear that you have found some new friends. Good for you." "They aren't friends, Nunnally," brother protested, "they're a means to an end." Which is almost certainly how my own friends see me, Nunnally thought. It was just a suspicion, one she had pointedly chosen not to confirm by never taking their hands in hers, but it was difficult to see any other reason for their interest in her. Perhaps they wish to get closer to brother, perhaps they are simply displaying a most un-Britannian pity for a cripple. Either way, they serve their purpose well enough, I suppose, by providing me with some company other than Sayoko while brother is occupied. So what are friends, brother, if not a means to an end? She patted his hand in teasing congratulations, enjoying his spluttering denials as she felt the truth behind his words through his grip. He was always so well-spoken around others, it was nice to know that he still allowed himself sufficient vulnerability around her to react like a child. It was even nicer to know that, try as he might, brother still had far too much empathy for others. After all, if he had already bonded so quickly with these true Anglicans, it surely meant that his bond with her was in no danger of fraying. Unless he decides to invest his time in those with actual value, Nunnally worried. He still has time for me, even with his friends on the student council, but rivals and surely never afforded much use for a prince, even a prince pretending to be a student. If he actually bonds with people willing to follow him, willing to help him, willing to kill for him, will he still have time to hold my hand? "You are correct, brother," the words came blurting out, almost before Nunnally could think them. "They are not your friends. You are wise to keep that in mind." "Nunnally?" His grip on her hand tightened, painful for a moment before brother remembered her frailty and regained control of himself with an apologetic murmur. The surprise lingered in his voice as he continued, though. You are correct, of course. But I am surprised to hear you agree with me. I mean," he forced a chuckle and Nunnally read the uneasy truth behind the joviality, "I had honestly expected you to scold me for being too risky or too callous toward them." "Weak? Do you want me to, brother?" Nunnally asked, hating her useless eyes again as she always did when she wondered what expression her brother's face bore while he measured her words. "I will happily chide you for taking the risk of fraternizing with proscribed heretics, should you wish, but," she sighed, knowing that the plaintive sound would tug on her brother's heartstrings and soften his discomfort, and hating herself for knowing as much and doing so anyway, "I know you, brother. You thrive on risks. Telling you to stay safe is foolishness." "Nunnally." The guilt in his voice was familiar. To Nunnally, it always sounded like old wood, the surfaces worn down and polished over the years for all the use it had borne. She had used that guilt time and time again, sometimes for small things and sometimes for important matters and sometimes just to prove to herself that she could make a difference, if only by the proxy of altering her brother's actions. Those last occasions made her feel guilty as well, although not guilty enough to stop laying hands on that familiar old lever. "I know you, brother," Nunnally continued, lowering her already damnably frail voice to a coo, hearing the rustle as brother stooped to get closer. "You are reckless and relentless, but you are also caring. I know that you like to think of yourself as aloof and cool as you pretend to be at school, but I also know how easily the distance you place between yourself and others shrinks when you allow them to get close. Do not allow yourself to get too close to these true Anglicans, brother." "Don't leave me behind," was the first of her unspoken messages. "Use them, don't allow yourself to be used by them," was the second. Honestly, she thought, concealing her scowl at the mingled confusion and compassion she felt in his hand, brother is far too soft for this, far too weak. If only I had his eyes, his legs, his luck. How fortunate that I already have a hand upon his heart. Use them, brother, Nunnally encouraged, levering herself up as best she could in her bed, her shoulders barely lifting from the sheets. Remember your goals, brother, and remember yourself. And remember me when you come into your kingdom, brother. Remember me when you avenge mother and claim your birthright. Please. Just remember me. July 5, 2016 ATB. Albert's Tap House, Kita Ward, Tokyo Settlement. 1830. Above the empty cellar turned secret sanctuary, the celebration raged on in the streets and in the tap house as it had for hours now, ever since the news had broken. Ever since the viceregal governor had declared, in a very special broadcast, a half-day general holiday to mark the occasion. The Yokohama sniper was dead, her reign of terror brought to a sudden and cinematic end. As good of a reason to celebrate as any, Lelouch reflected as he grabbed a pair of kneeling pillows from the communal pile, one for himself and one for Millie. Besides, a holiday is a holiday. To bastardize a line, the celebration will feed itself. Smirking quietly at the irreverent thought, Lelouch turned back to the knot of true Anglicans, milling around as they awaited Father Timothy's arrival. Although, perhaps not no longer does the congregation justice. Their numbers had expanded over the 2 months Lelouch had spent in the company of the underground church, in no small part due to his efforts and Millie's. The first clandestine service he had attended had a mere 27 ragged souls, the majority of them elderly, in attendance. 29, with the addition of Father Timothy and himself. Now, more than twice that number crowded the basement, several still in uniform and others in the garb of professional tradesmen or well-heeled clerks. We've doubled our numbers, Lelouch thought with justifiable satisfaction, and not just at this congregation either. Working his way back through the crowd to the front oriented toward the old church banner, where he had left Millie, Lelouch shook hands and exchanged nods and smiles of recognition with familiar faces. Havelock was there, the excitable poet from that long-ago trivia night, along with Hilda and her husband Charles, who stood tall and proud with a dog-eared copy of the Book of Common Prayer in his hands. Closer to the front stood Colour Sergeant Coffin, now a full month distant from the bottle and already looking years younger for it. Would that they were all so willing to follow my suggestions. Lelouch hid a sigh behind a smile as he shook another hand. There's power in the scraps of authority I've acquired, but a pulpit it is not. Waiting for him in the very first row of imaginary pews was Millie, fully costumed in the long skirt and high neckline preferred by Millie Ashland. She had made a concession to the heat of the season, and perhaps to her own particular tastes. Gone was the shawl she had previously worn draped about her shoulders. Instead, her sleeves had been rolled up so high past her elbows that her blouse almost resembled a casual shirt, save for the garment's cut. The seemingly effortless charm that Lelouch knew she assembled each morning and wore like a mantle still followed her though, modest and understated clothes be damned. She still stood out in the congregation like gold among straw. Of course, Lelouch thought with a slightly guilty pang, Nunnally would stand out even more. Not that his darling sister was content to remain on the sidelines, not in the slightest. After Lelouch had brought Nunnally in on his latest plan 2 months ago, she had taken to her advisory role like a fish to water. Each time he returned from some quiet trip to the fringes of the settlement or slipped back into the quiet apartment over the clubhouse after meeting with Father Timothy for private lessons on the true Anglican creed, Nunnally had been up and waiting for him to return, eager to go over his latest experiences and mine for ideas or angles. Nunnally's incredible enthusiasm and willingness to help him brainstorm new recruitment schemes as well as possible solutions to various issues bedeviling existing members had been a happy surprise. Millie's understandable reserve regarding his involvement in a church of hidden heretics had been much less surprising, though entirely understandable. At least, Millie had been reserved toward the idea of joining a heretical fringe movement initially. When she learned that Charles, Hilda, and Havelock, their trivia-playing partners, were also members of the church, she warmed up to the idea, presumably on the basis that the former two were sensible enough to not get involved in anything too crazy. And both have been instrumental in helping me become instrumental to Father Timothy and his congregation, Lelouch thought, returning Millie's smile. Not that they aren't essential too, honestly, considering how much the congregation adores the first of my confederates, it is almost a pity that they will likely never learn about the second. Thanks, the incognito heiress chirped as he handed over a cushion, casting a critical eye over the foam bulging through the tattered seams. Man, I really should bring my sewing kit one of these days. You can sew? Lelouch asked, curious despite himself. I don't think I've ever seen you with a needle and thread. Duh, Brother Alexander. The dramatic eye roll following that exasperated reply was entirely Millie Ashford, but thankfully sass was part of her disguise's persona as well. Lelouch doubted even Millie's considerable talents as an actress could have fully concealed that. Who do you think makes all those costumes you love ever so much? Before Lelouch could rebut and clarify his opinion on the costumes his friend had foisted on him in the past, he noticed the poorly concealed stares from the other church members standing around. Several grannies looked a hair's breadth from laughing at his expense, while at least two of the new soldier converts looked like they were busy imagining what costumes he had loved on Millie. As always, there seemed like no point in protesting. Judging by the twinkle in Millie's eyes, it would only make the teasing worse. Well, he lamely replied instead, meeting an inelegant retreat instead of fighting a losing battle, I'll remind you next time, Sister Jane. Before Sister Jane could respond, Lelouch had turned back to make his way back through the crowd again, this time unencumbered by pillows and with his hat quite literally in his hands. One hand held the second-hand bowler out, upturned and pointedly empty, while the other remained free to shake hands and slap backs. A few crumpled banknotes disappeared into the faded lining as Brother Alexander made his way down the first line of parishioners, old ladies and gentlemen reaching into handbags and wallets to find what they could give up. The next row, day laborers mixed with skilled tradesmen, yielded a hail of pound coins and, from one man in the starched collar uniform of an accountant, a brown envelope firmly taped shut. Thank you, Brother Jackson, Lelouch murmured to the last man, appropriately discreet. Your contributions are appreciated. How's Teresa? Doing well, Brother Alexander, replied the first-generation Britannian, the son of a 7 honorary and a Britannian mother. He had been one of Lelouch's first recruits. Lelouch had managed to snag his loyalty with Millie's connections, putting him in contact with a physician willing to provide discreet surgical corrections to certain clientele. The man's daughter had the misfortune to be born with a facial deformity that would have otherwise forever marked her as inferior in Britannian society, but with the right funds and the right friends, it was an issue of the past. The bandages will be coming off next week. Thank you again for... No need for that, brother, Lelouch smoothly interrupted, patting the man's arm. Just remember who your brothers and sisters are when the time comes. He continued on like that, shuttling through the congregation with a word here, a smile there, the bowler getting progressively heavier in his hand. Eventually, Lelouch turned back around and returned back to the first row, where Millie was holding court. As she saw him approach, she waved a dismissal and the 2 young soldiers who'd been hanging off her every word stepped back. Nodding a greeting, Lelouch retook his place next to her, discreetly nudging the hat full of donations out in front of his pillow so he wouldn't accidentally upset the collection when it came time to pray. As he stood up, a ripple passed through the crowd as conversations fell silent and people fell into their ordered rows, leaving a neat aisle from the entrance to the basement on up to the front of the hidden church. Up the cleared aisle, an old man limped. Father Timothy had arrived at last. Perhaps fittingly, the priest who had summoned his congregation for this impromptu and unscheduled meeting was the last to arrive. He had forsaken his vestments, Lelouch noticed, save for the faded stole hanging from his shoulders. Some might have chalked that up to this being a Tuesday and thus not the designated meeting time for the weekly mass. Better informed about old Tim's flagging health, Lelouch knew that the old man could no longer don the Roman collar that was the sign of his office, He no longer had the strength to breathe with even the collar's mild constriction banded about his neck. Mnemonic or not, Father Timothy still had the necessary strength to raise his voice in greeting as he turned to face his congregation from below the banner that had once decorated his pulpit. "The Lord be with you." "And also with you," the congregation replied in a dull rumble, the old words falling neatly into place, following tracks worn smooth with repetition. "Let us give thanks to the Lord our God," Father Timothy intoned, raising a trembling hand high. "It is right to give him thanks and praise," agreed the congregation, speaking with one voice. "Ah, but what shall we thank him for this day?" The question, a break from the typical ritual call and response that initiated the Mass, seemed to throw the congregation into a moment of confusion, swiftly ended by Father Timothy answering his own question. "I myself shall thank him for bringing all of us together today. But for us all, why, let us give thanks that he has seen fit to bring a final end to the reign of terror perpetrated by the Yokohama sniper. Let us give thanks, brothers and sisters, for his grace." "Thanks be to you, Lord Christ," came the fervent response from every other tongue present, Lelouch's included. Although the thanks would probably be best directed to the EB, he considered, not that they would be happy to accept such remarks from the likes of us. But, Father Timothy's hands fell to his side, while it is meet and right to thank the Lord for his mercy in ridding us of the vile 11 scourge, it is equally proper to take the opportunity to mourn for our fallen. As one, the congregation bowed their heads, the motion smoothly automatic even among the new converts. While the dogma of the state church had changed, the trappings of the rituals had remained all but the same. Which, Lelouch thought as he angled his face toward the floor, provides a convenient point of familiarity for newcomers to cling onto even as the substance shifts below their feet. While the sniper is felled, the shadow cast by her acts lingers on in absent faces and lives cut short. Father Timothy paused to cough, the wet hacking forcing its way out of his chest and into the crook of his elbow. But as the coughing fit passed, he raised his hands anew. "Blood cannot wipe away blood," he intoned, "nor can death wipe away death. We cannot bring back our lost, for that is solely the Lord's domain, instead we must wait until our judgment day to see them again. And so, we mourn the loss of 34 Britannians, avenged yet still lost to us nonetheless." 64, a voice from the congregation interrupted. "Not to contradict you, Father, but we lost 64 of our own." That voice. Lelouch turned toward the source of the interruption, eyes widening with surprise. Sergeant Coffin? And it was Sergeant Coffin whom all in attendance now stared, the burly noncom standing tall and meeting the weight of their gazes squarely, showing no sign of backing down. "This is unexpected." The man's initial wave of almost drunken zealotry had cooled and hardened into a firm loyalty that had already served Lelouch in good stead as he expanded his efforts to find converts among the garrison forces, but Coffin only rarely ventured an independent opinion, and generally only when directly asked. For him to interrupt the service like this. "Forgive me," Father Timothy replied, peering through tired eyes at the soldier, "but all of the reports I have seen placed the final death toll at 34. Where are you getting your number from, Brother Roger?" "Yes, sir," confirmed Sergeant Coffin, bobbing his head in a brief nod. "That is what all of the talking heads are saying. But what about the honorary citizens, eh? That bitch nailed 30 of them, are we not going to remember them as well?" "Ah yes," Father Timothy replied, his lip wrinkling in clear distaste. "The honoraries." The disdain in the old priest's voice was almost palpable. "The honoraries, yup," replied Coffin, his Maine accent thickening as he glared back at the cleric, seeming not to notice the silent pressure for him to fall back into line. "They're just as much of us as the poor dead Britannians, aren't they now? They took up the oath, didn't they? Swore to serve in return for citizenship, didn't they? And they were Britannian enough to put a bullet through the sniper's lousy head, weren't they?" That last point sent a ripple of murmuring through the crowd. The statement put out by the Bureau of Investigation informing the public of the sniper's death had been quite clear in the composition of the unit that had hunted her down. Honorary constables had killed the Yokohama sniper, not Britannian regulars. Suzaku. It was vanishingly unlikely that his old friend had been involved in the EB's operation. As far as Lelouch knew, Corporal Kururugi was still serving with the 32nd Honorary Legion. The same formation that Sergeant Coffin serves in. Lelouch hadn't pursued that connection, despite personal desire. There was, after all, no reason for either Leland Gelt or Brother Alexander to have any interest in a random honorary noncom. If Suzaku hadn't brought himself to Sergeant Coffin's attention on his own, then Lelouch had no intention of drawing unwanted attention to his friend. But for Coffin to feel sufficiently attached to his men that he speaks up on the behalf of their comrades in arms. The knot in Lelouch's chest loosened slightly. Be that as it may, Father Timothy replied, just as hard-headed as Sergeant Coffin, they are not of us, Brother Roger. They swore their oaths, yes, but they swore them to a usurper emperor and his handmaiden of a church. And what oaths can be held as consecrated and true and sworn by false names and in the honor of perversion? Any oath sworn to Charles, the man of blood, cannot be binding, any more than an oath sworn to a foreigner could be. They are not of us. But how were they to know as much when they took up the oath? Lelouch stepped out from his row and into the cleared aisle running between the two blocks of standing worshippers. Far from coincidentally, his chosen place to stand placed him squarely between Father Timothy and Sergeant Coffin. He looked from one to the other as he extended an arm toward each. How were they to know, he repeated, looking at Coffin and the small sea of faces around him, when they swore their oath that the ruler they swore to was an evil, twisted mockery of all that is good and right about Britannia? How were they to know that the priest who anointed him as Emperor of Britannia and head of its church was a heretic determined to pervert the holy ways with corrupt doctrine? How were they to know, Lelouch continued, turning to face Father Timothy, allowing his arms to fall to his sides as he firmly turned his back towards Sergeant Coffin, when there were none to teach them the correct doctrine, to show them the true way forward? Is ignorance a sin, even in light of such service as killing a foul wolf who preyed upon the innocent fold of our misguided brothers and sisters? Millie's gaze was like a brand on his cheek, burning a hole through his face with its intense focus. He kept his eyes focused on Father Timothy, ignoring her stare and the consideration and worry he knew he would see if he turned to meet it. Alone among those present, she knew about Suzaku, knew about his friend in the service, who had sworn his oath to that man, and had turned his back on Lelouch and on Japan in the process. Lelouch fought off the urge to cringe in embarrassment. He'd done it again, damn it. He had seen a golden opportunity and had impulsively seized it, just as he had sworn to himself he would not do. Yes, Millie knew of his motives for seeking reconciliation with the honorary Britannians. She, alone among those in attendance, also knew his real identity, knew the name nested below Brother Alexander, Leland Gelt, and Lelouch Lamperouge. She certainly knew the kind of risk he was running by publicly drawing attention to himself like this, and by proxy the risk he was posing to her and her family. I'm sorry, Millie. But I must help Suzaku, and if this church can pose a safe haven for him, perhaps I can smuggle him out of the Legion before the worst comes to pass. So it was with mixed feelings that Lelouch raised his hands again, imploring Father Timothy to hear the sensibility of his words and their weight on his tongue. I say that, so long as they swore loyalty to Britannia in their hearts, then surely God will know his own. For better or for worse, he will surely acknowledge their pledge and know them by the works of their hands to be true servants of Britannia. An unwanted image of Corporal Kururugi glaring at a line of hungry honoraries queuing up for food served by Japanese hands forced itself into Lelouch's mind. A true servant of Britannia indeed. There was a rustle of motion to his side and Lelouch knew without looking away from Father Timothy that Millie had stepped up beside him. Britannian or honorary? The Ashford heiress mused, slipping her hand into his as she spoke. In his mind's eye, Lelouch could imagine what it must look like, the young lovers, standing steadfast in their convictions in the face of convention. It was an admittedly powerful visual narrative, instantly relatable to all and sympathetic to most. Count on Millie to seize on an opportunity for drama, Lelouch thought wryly, keeping his amusement firmly contained. And, his thoughts continued as her fingers slid between his own, Count on Millie to take full advantage of the moment. Surely all are equal in death? Millie paused, giving her audience a moment to consider the matter. Surely a Britannian soldier and an honorary soldier, both sworn to the same empire's service, will be counted as equals in the regiments of the Most High? Just as we are all equals, brothers and sisters all, in his earthly service. And, Millie lightly squeezed his hand, adding the honoraries to our list of prayers surely costs us little, right? Some of them did manage to put down the sniper, after all. Lelouch returned the gentle squeeze, touched by the unspoken message and the implicit understanding of his motives Millie displayed. Clearly, she hadn't forgotten his plea for help for Suzaku. With that in mind, he couldn't begrudge her forwarding their false relationship at all. Not for now, at least. For his part, Father Timothy looked thoughtful. His distaste still lingered, but clearly he was listening to what they were saying. A traditionalist at heart, the old cleric wouldn't have survived so long if he was too stubborn to notice when the winds of change began to blow. Objections from the senior-most military man recruited so far, from the only recruit with sufficient education and energy to act as a minister as his health flagged, and from the most successful recruiter the church had found so far, were enough combined to represent a veritable gust. "Very well then," he said at last, bowing to the inevitable. "We will remember our honorary brothers and sisters as well in our prayers. Now," Timothy cleared his throat, "please kneel as we pray." A murmur of movement coursed through the congregation as men and women, impoverished and merely poor, knelt on ratty cushions. Still out in the aisle between the two blocks of attendees, Lelouch knelt directly on the stained concrete floor of the old basement, Millie joining him a moment later with a pained hiss as her knees met the unyielding and grainy surface. For his part, as he bowed his head in an empty gesture of reverence to an existence he was agnostic at best toward, Lelouch found himself reveling in the uncomfortable pressure against his kneecaps. It was a welcome distraction from both the hands still firmly wrapped around his own, and from the sure knowledge of what was soon to come for Yokohama. "O God," Father Timothy began, raising his hands in supplication, "whose mercies cannot be numbered, accept our prayers on behalf of your servants, both those born to the church and those who came to it later, and grant them an entrance into the land of light and joy, in the fellowship of thy saints, through Jesus Christ thy Son our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with a rod of iron with thee and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen," chorused the congregation, Lelouch allowing the word to slip limply from between his lips and Millie with surprising vigor. "For Christ is risen from the dead," Father Timothy continued, painfully lowering himself down to his waiting kneeling cushion, "and with the sword and the rod he laid waste to hell and conquered it for his own. With the sword he cut the chains of the grave and rose in glory and triumph. He trampled down the adversary and gave death unto death, and restored life to the entombed righteous. He will come again in the company of his legions and his saints to judge and to rule again, as he did in the days before the fall. Amen. Amen," replied the assembled people. From behind him, Lelouch heard Coffin's voice, rough from a life of barking orders, brimming with righteous fervor. "Amen. O Lord God most whole." Timothy stopped, wrapping an arm about his chest as he coughed, his shoulders heaving at the violence of the action. "O Lord," he rasped, beginning again, "in the midst of life we are in death, and from whom shall we seek succor? O Lord, save yourself, who for our sins is greatly angered. Truly, Lord, from you no secrets are hid and to you all sins are known. Spare us, O God, and deliver us not into the bitterest of death and the scourge everlasting, but let us march beside you and St. George and St. Sebastian and all of your martyrs in glory. For this, we pray. Amen." "Speak with me," Father Timothy commanded, "O brothers and sisters, the affirmation of our faith. Christ has died in suffering." The congregation spoke as one, Father Timothy's thin reed of a voice wavering like a flag over the dull monotone chant, "Christ is risen in glory. Christ will come again in conquest. Yea, he shall." Father Timothy confirmed, spreading out his arms again in reassurance, "and so in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection to life eternal through the passion and might of Lord Jesus Christ, we commend all of his martyred servants to Almighty God, Britannian born and Britannian by honor alike, and we commit their bodies to the ground or to the flame. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Amen. Let us now take a moment, brothers and sisters. Father Timothy wheezed, his shoulders jerking as he fought down another coughing fit, to remember in silence those who have perished. Britannian and honorary Britannian alike. And Japanese, Lelouch added silently, closing his eyes. Proclamation 9 proclaimed that each Britannian death would be repaid 1,000-fold. Whether he ever intended to execute the proclamation in earnest or not is irrelevant now. The purists will demand it, as will the bulk of the rank and file of the commons. After the media whipped them up in the fear of death by sniper for weeks, they'll be hungry for blood, and Clovis is far too cowardly to deny them their wish. And so, the Japanese will pay the price, at least for now. I know what is coming, and I can do nothing to stop it. Lelouch realized his teeth were grinding, that he was squeezing down far too tightly on Millie's hand. He forced himself to relax, to breathe out his tension. After a moment, she lightly squeezed his hand again, silently asking if he was all right. He squeezed back in reassurance and fell back into his thoughts. More blood on the hands of Clovis. And by extension, more blood on the hands of that man, more blood that I was too weak to stop from being spilled. And now, brothers and sisters, Father Timothy said, breaking the basement's silence, we make bold to say, Our Father, who art in heaven. Go now in the faith and unity of Christ the King, the only true Emperor, and know that his triumph is only an inevitability. Lelouch bid, arms raised to the exact angle used earlier in the service by Father Timothy. Go forth knowing that your deeds and dedication are heeded, that your faith shall be rewarded, and that one day all will curse by the foul name of the man of blood. Amen. Amen, came the resounding echo, full of both hope for the future and relief that the service was finally over. Lelouch lowered his arms and shot a sideways look to Father Timothy, who nodded his thanks and approval. Brother Leland had been invited up to conduct the remainder of the service after the conclusion of the Lord's Prayer, a measure both practical and keenly symbolic. Practical, because the old priest's cough had continued to worsen as he struggled through the prayer, and symbolic, as the parting benediction was generally administered by the ranking cleric in attendance. By waving Leland up from the crowd to end the service and to dismiss the congregation, Father Timothy had signaled his rising status yet again. Now, Leland stood between the congregation and the pulpit, not quite a priest but certainly not a layman any longer. With the ritual of the service concluded, the structure of the crowd disintegrated, the illusory rows vanishing as congregants turned to chat with their neighbors, stooped to pick up knee pillows, or began the process of stowing their personal copies of the Book of Common Prayer within jackets, purses, or in one case, in a hollow concealed in the sole of a boot. Lelouch joined the milling throng and easily fell into a succession of casual conversations, shaking hands and catching up on the daily happenings of various acquaintances as, one by one, the hidden church slipped out through the bar or the basement entrance and into the still busy streets. As he glad-handed and chatted, Lelouch felt Father Timothy's eyes linger upon him, weighing his every action and word. Slowly, the crowd dispersed, until the basement was empty of all save Millie, Father Timothy, and Lelouch. Sensing that the priest had something he wanted to say as clearly as Lelouch, Millie made eye contact with Lelouch and nodded toward the old man before jerking her head up toward the bar. Her message was clear: hear him out, and then come tell me what's up. I'll be waiting. With a confirming nod from Lelouch, Millie vanished up the stairs. Lelouch waited, listening to the old slats creak under her weight, hearing the slight pause as she stooped under the dangling HVAC duct, and then the slight jingle of the bell above signaling that the door into the common room of the tap house had opened. Then, he turned to Father Timothy and waited, expectant, as the frail and sickly elder picked his way across the bare concrete floor. Good work with the benediction, Brother Alexander, the priest said, coming to a halt in front of Lelouch. Always send them out on a high note, that's what I was taught all the way back in seminary. You have a natural gift for the pulpit, it seems. Thank you, Father, Lelouch replied politely. Yes, the old man mused, as if he hadn't heard the response, you were certainly born for leadership, Brother Alexander. You chose your worship name well, Leland. chose it well indeed. Under his thick, bushy grey eyebrows and behind the yellow room lining his ancient eyes, a keen and watchful intelligence glittered. "Thank you, Father," Lelouch repeated, suddenly wary of the man who had served as his introduction to the disparate true Anglican cells scattered around the Tokyo settlement, the man in whose stead he had acted for months now. "I appreciate your confidence. I believe it to be well placed, Leland." A weary smile crossed Father Timothy's face. Spending almost 2 decades on the run teaches a man a thing or two about human character, and how to judge it. And I find myself placing more and more faith in your abilities, Leland. Born to the grandson of a third son, was it? Before you left the homeland? He knows. The thought sent a shock through Lelouch's arms, down to his hands, utterly absurd yet somehow certainly true. Somehow, he knows. "Yes, Father," Lelouch replied, drawing on his long-ago lessons from court to keep his cool. "A family dispute that led to my pursuit of other opportunities across the Pacific from old Pendragon." "I see." Father Timothy seemed to consider something, his eyes boring through Lelouch. "You have done sterling service, ministering to my flock all around the settlement. You know all of their names now, their problems, and details about each. They come to you, always eager to speak, because they believe that you will lighten their load. They believe the same thing about you," Lelouch pointed out, attempting to deflect the probe. "I noticed as much when I first came here. They all believe in you, believe in your witness and your word. And it took long years for me to build that faith," Father Timothy remarked mildly. "Years of hard work and long suffering. Years that you have made up in weeks." "I'm not jealous," he said, holding up a staying hand, "not at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. I am." A tired smile pulled itself across the worn face as Father Timothy paused, as if savoring the word. "Relieved." "Relieved, Father?" Lelouch tilted his head inquiringly, doing his best to involve himself in the conversation as fully as possible to ignore the way his nerves were singing with anxiety. "About what?" "That though I will die without seeing the true prince sit the throne in Pendragon, I shall pass on like Moses, content that my successor shall bring an end to the long journey I began 18 years ago," explained Father Timothy, his voice serene despite its exhaustion. Years fell away for a brief moment, as if the pure relief was burning through the accumulated weight of old age and hard living. "I have devoted my life to this cause, and as the candle of my life began to flicker, I allowed doubt to enter my heart. I see now that I was wrong to do so. Perhaps that is why that candle has begun to gutter." "You still have years left in you, Father," Lelouch reassured, not believing a word of it. There was, he was certain, nobody worthy of sitting the Britannian throne. Anybody with sufficient moral fiber to be proclaimed as such would burn that wretched old chair to ashes before so much as squatting above it. "I told you at our first meeting," Father Timothy replied, shaking his head, "death is in my bones. I said then that I will not see Christmas, I say now that I will not see August." I see, Father," said Lelouch, blinking as the thought entered his mind. The timeline would have to be moved up, of course, and he would have to consult with Millie and Sergeant Coffin about their next moves, and perhaps bring Brother Philip in. "Yes," Father Timothy nodded approvingly, clearly reading Lelouch's thoughts on his face. "Do not let the moment go to waste, my Joshua. Strike while the iron is hot, and let none stand in your way. Within the month, my bones will be cold and my people yours, although they are in truth yours already, are they not? Purple eyes. Fitting for a man born to the purple." The comment, delivered so casually, was a whip slashing down on Lelouch's back once again, startling him with the blow. His whole world stopped, the corners of his vision growing dark as his balance shifted and quaked around him. Before him, Father Timothy, old Tim, stood placidly, not making any attempt to run, to defend himself. Miraculously, Lelouch held his control firm, keeping his hands flat by his sides. Even more miraculously, he managed to hold his tongue, matching the old man's silent stare with his own stillness. "I will not live to see the true prince sit his throne," murmured Father Timothy, eyes distant, his voice growing rough again. After years of hiding from long knives and running from corner to desolate corner, it won't be the Inquisition that gets me, nor the Bureau, nor even the army. Just a pair of worn-out lungs, drowning in their own phlegm. I will not live to see the true prince upon his throne, but I have lived long enough to know that the end has come for the man of blood. The reign of Charles the Usurper has ended, and he doesn't even know it yet. That seems premature, Lelouch ventured, doing his best again to ignore the stubborn old priest's talk of thrones as he slowly pushed the clanging anxiety the risky line of conversation invoked back down. The man hates the emperor, hates the Britannic Church, Lelouch reassured himself. He's not going to turn anybody over to them now that he is at death's door. Besides, who would believe a sick old man when he claimed he'd found a secret Britannian prince who was a heretic to boot? Especially not if he admitted to being a recalcitrant priest in the same breath. Have faith, Father Timothy chided, his smile growing by an extra tooth. It's a great solace, my son. I have faith. I feared before what would become of my church, once I was no longer around to lead it, but now I know what the future will bring for my church, for the church, and for the empire and the world. I know, Brother Alexander, that you are that future, that you will bring the sword and the rod and will guide my people unto the promised land. Keep the faith, when I am gone. July 14, 2016 ATB. Student Council Room, Ashford Academy. 1215. It was a beautiful day outside, a rare summer day where a skimming of high-altitude clouds and a favorable breeze from Tokyo Bay conspired to reduce the heat and humidity down to balmy perfection. Regrettably, Lelouch was in no position to enjoy the glories of summer. For multiple reasons. It had been a stressful 2 weeks. Ever since that damned priest had. With a quiet growl, Lelouch wrenched his attention back to the teetering stack of printouts, envelopes, and notarized documents towering above his desk, the better part of a month's paperwork come due at last. And all of it for me. Huzzah! Despite himself, Lelouch found the heap a perverse sanctuary, a balm numbing his frenzied thoughts. No matter how many times he woke in a cold sweat, belly clenched with anxiety, at the end of the day the janitorial staff still needed their payroll run. Most students of Ashford Academy would, if pressed, admit to an understanding that the student council had functions other than acting as Millie Ashford's personal toy. Lelouch suspected that most of the student body would be shocked to learn just how much time and energy serving on the student council demanded, and how little of it was spent either playing along with or refusing Millie's various whims. For some reason best known to himself, Reuben Ashford, once Lord Ashford, had endowed significant administerial responsibilities upon the student council some 2 summers ago in commemoration of his heiress's 16th birthday. At the stroke of a pen, the student council had become responsible for the entirety of the academy's discretionary fund, as well as for running the payroll for the janitorial and gardening staff. Perhaps the former aristocrat had seen it as a way of replicating in miniature the old tradition of entrusting an estate to the heir presumptive to give them some managerial experience in advance of their inheritance. Perhaps it had been an attempt to occupy some of Millie's boundless energy. Either way, by the time Millie had turned 17 the previous year, the student council had become intimately familiar with the processes of budgetary formation, labor arbitration, and contract remediation. Excellent stewardship training for the heir to a fairly sizable estate, Lelouch conceded, initialing a request from the Equestrian Club for a replacement track as their previous training ground had been requisitioned by the ROTC. Or it would be, if Millie actually handled a tenth of the paperwork. Then again, delegation is a valuable skill in a leader as well. Theoretically, anyway. Always the money changer of favors, Millie had cashed in all the evenings she had spent covering for Lelouch's activities at last. She had, as she put it, tolerated being a walking smokescreen for all of her free evenings, so now he could handle her share of the backlogged paperwork. And here I thought you'd finally brought me in on your illicit gambling operation, Lulu. Instead, all you did was take me to church. Had been her pouting comment on the matter, before dropping her faux annoyance in favor of a devilish grin. You owe me big, Mr. Vice President. So here he was, wasting away and trying to find some room in the discretionary budget to pay stabling and track fees for the equestrian club's mounts at some estate outside of the Tokyo settlement instead of enjoying the summer's day with Nunnally. His sister had uncharacteristically left Ashford for the day, venturing forth for a day of shopping and fun in the concession in the company of a few of her friends, the ever-dutiful Sayoko standing ready at his darling sister's elbow. The presence of the secret bodyguard, keen awareness of the ever-accumulating stack of paperwork waiting for his attention, and his sister's clear eagerness for a moment of freedom from the confines of the academy had conspired against Lelouch, and he hadn't offered even token resistance to Nunnally's plan. I do hope she remembered her sunscreen, though. Lelouch sighed, the anxiety he always felt whenever Nunnally left Ashford's protective embrace heightened by a week's worth of nights haunted by dreams of thrones and ermine robes. Sayoko will handle it, he told himself, crushing the anxious thoughts down. She is a professional and highly skilled. Nunnally is safe. All is well. For a moment, Lelouch sat still in his chair, fingers poised above the keyboard. He strained, trying to resist the temptation, trying to hold the line. His traitor mind served up an image of Nunnally with sunburns on her poor sweet face, skin peeling from her delicate nose. In moments his phone was unlocked and in his hand. 30 seconds later, a text reminding Sayoko to remind Nunnally that the SPF 70 was in the kitchen drawer right by the refrigerator was sent. A minute and a half after sending his text, Lelouch felt incredibly silly as a reply definitely not written by Sayoko arrived, the slight grammatical errors betraying the aid of a speech-to-text program. Nunnally, as was so often the case, kindly thanked her dear big brother for his concern but assured him that she was only blind and not brain-dead. Her wish for him to butt out and allow her to enjoy her afternoon of freedom undisturbed was as loud as it was unspoken. Not that Lelouch was at all upset by this. She was a teenager now, he reminded himself, in the midst of her rebellious phase. Such disregard for pseudo-parental worry was only to be expected, at least in private. With perhaps slightly more force than was required, Lelouch rubbed the approval ink stamp on its pad and brought it down on the equestrian club's proposal, tossing the document into his out tray. Whenever rivals finished fiddling around with his motorcycle, the student council secretary would enter the outlay from the proposal into the budgetary software and then file the document away. Shirley would finally approve the amended budget item and the equestrian club would receive permission to start hunting for a new stable. Bully for them, he thought with knee-jerk resentment toward anybody not stuck inside handling paperwork. But perhaps that would be an opportunity? Moving all of the horses would require several trips in large vehicles, all with appropriate paperwork and probably reeking of manure. Shelving the idea for later reflection, Lelouch reached for the next item in his overflowing tray. Before he could snag the next proposal, complaint, or memo from the stack, the door to the student council room swung open. Did Rivals finish tuning up his bike already? Lelouch wondered as he looked up from his paper-strewn desk, or maybe Millie let it slip to Shirley that I'm alone in the council room? Either way, they just volunteered to help with the backlog. Instead of the student council's secretary or its treasurer, Lelouch's number one source of heartburn short of that man's continued existence slipped into the room and pulled the door firmly shut behind her. By the time the latch clicked in the frame, all thoughts of budgets and paperwork had slipped from Lelouch's mind. He was in danger, he knew. Any moment he was alone with Callan Stadtfeld represented a significant risk to his well-being. While the détente he had forged between them still held, strengthened by Millie's sincere apology to Callan and her good behavior toward the Stadtfeld heiress over the last 2 months, Lelouch had not forgotten the peril the probable rebel posed. Nor had he forgotten the potential she represented. A natural-born prodigy pilot is worth a bit of risk on her own, but a plug into the heart of the Japanese underground and a potential connection to the weapons and resources flowing from Chinese and European hands into Area 11 would be worth a great deal. That had been his decision 2 months ago. Every time they met, Lelouch recalculated that risk, weighing up the stakes. So far, his initial decision held. "Ah, Callan," greeted Lelouch, nodding a friendly welcome and taking care to rest his hands on the desk in clear view of his guest. I thought you weren't going to be here today? Major Pitt has you marked down as excused absent, you know. Oh? Callan blinked, disinterested. Good to know, I guess. But, no, I'm not here today, not officially. I'm just here to drop this off. She glanced down at his desk and blinked again, this time surprised. The custodial payroll? Following her eyes, Lelouch looked down at the document he had retrieved from his in-tray just as Callan entered the room and saw those exact words printed across the top. What of it? He blandly asked, meeting her eyes once again and lifting an inquisitive eyebrow. Isn't that women's work, balancing the accounts? Callan asked, her slight smirk tugging at her lips. I mean, she continued, her voice dripping with faux innocence, that's what my mother always insists during our lessons. What of it? Lelouch repeated, the second eyebrow rising to join its predecessor. It's all Millie's work, if it makes you feel any better. She called in a favor, he hastily added, noticing how Callan's gaze began to heat at the implication that Millie was abusing her power over someone else. I asked for her help with something and agreed to her price of assistance with the paperwork. All right, said Callan, subsiding slightly. But really, Lelouch. The payroll. Are you sure you don't find it demeaning or whatever? She sounds almost intrigued, Lelouch noted, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. I wonder how angry she would be if I pointed out how similarly the majority of Ashford's female population reacted when I was introduced as the belle of the crossdressers' ball last autumn. Not in the slightest, he replied, completely sincere. Honestly, I think I lost my capacity for shame in this specific context after the fourth time she crammed me into a dress. Didn't you have something to drop off, Callan? Oh, yeah. Callan tore her fascinated gaze away from the hour sheet on his desk. 1 second. As she reached into the purse dangling from her shoulder, Lelouch clenched his teeth, forcing his smile to remain in place, his eyes to stay interested and guileless, his hands to keep loose and still. To his great relief, she retrieved only an envelope, which he deposited neatly on top of the summit of his in-tray. Waiting until she'd finished and after it was clear that her addition had not triggered a paperwork avalanche, Lelouch slowly reached out across the desk toward the envelope, keeping his eyes locked on Callan's face, searching for any warnings that the Crimson Viper on the other side of the table was about to strike. Her eyes narrowed slightly as he touched the envelope, but she relaxed again as his hand retreated, letter in tow. She really needs to work on governing her micro-expressions, Lelouch reflected as he carefully reached for a letter opener, and then rethought his course of action as he noticed a slight tightening of the muscles around her jaw. She's still far too easily read. Which I suppose I should be thankful for, at least for now. The envelope, stamped with the Stadtfeld coat of arms, contained a single, tersely worded page. Between the usual salutations and the formulaic farewell, the letter announced that Lady Callan Stadtfeld would be taking a sabbatical from Ashford Academy and her obligations as a member of the Student Council for the remainder of the summer. Interestingly, the letter also stated that the Lady Callan would also be discharging her duties as a cadet under special supervision for that same period of time. The letter was signed by Alvin, Baron New Leicester, and Lord Stadtfeld, Patriarch of House Stadtfeld, and co-signed by the noble staring coolly down at Lelouch from across his desk. I wonder what the chances are that the good Lord Stadtfeld actually signed this. Lelouch turned the idea around in his head, pretending to reread the letter as he thought. If the signature is authentic, that implies Callan's father has come to Area 11, which is interesting, I suppose, but not really important. If she forged his signature and is taking a vacation on her own recognizance, though. I wonder where she could be going. So, Lelouch began, breaking the silence as he refolded the letter. A summer-long sabbatical, is it? Sounds like an excellent idea. He attempted a gormless smile, aiming for a jolly note. Callan didn't return it. Lelouch's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. Something had changed. Why is she being so prickly all of a sudden? She was more than content to join Millie and me for lunch yesterday, and she even unbent far enough to be the fourth so rivals, Millie, and I could play a hand of bridge the day before. It is as if she regressed a month overnight. The idea that Callan could be trying to get away from the academy suddenly seemed much more likely. She was certainly hiding something. Do you have any plans for your sabbatical? The question was meant to sound innocuous, a puff question that blanketed his first gentle probe. Under Callan's blank stare, it hung impotently in the air. Patience abruptly departing, Lelouch rammed the probe home. With your father, I mean. It is his signature on the letter, is it not? Lelouch asked, shifting to a pointed, rudely direct, inquiry. Again the itching in his palms as a Pacific gaze, cold and dark, sized him up, searching for something Lelouch couldn't guess. Lelouch met Callan's eyes directly, refusing to back down. It was stupid, pointlessly risky, but it had been a trying fortnight, and he had work to do. Fortunately, whatever Callan had been searching for, she had apparently found. Her hand stayed in the open as well, blissfully knife-free. We will be going on a tour, the young noble replied, the delay between question and answer just slightly too long to be comfortable or natural, of Area 11. A tour of Area 11, Lelouch repeated, rolling the Britannian name, no, name was giving too much credit, the Britannian designation, over his tongue and noting the flash of distaste that crossed Callan's face at the sound. In her mouth, the official name for the conquered archipelago had sounded almost natural. Perhaps she was learning. A point toward this vacation not being her idea, he noted, adding a mental tally to the appropriate imaginary column. That or she still has yet to realize just how subpar her acting skills are. Perhaps both. That sounds like an excellent idea, Lelouch smoothly continued, smiling broadly as he leaned back in his chair, feigning relaxation while carefully keeping his hands in sight. The Sapporo settlement must be splendid this time of year, certainly less humid than Tokyo. Perhaps Kurofuto would be even better? Probably, Callan shrugged, the gesture comparatively unguarded. I've never been further north than Sendai. Ah, she corrected herself, a muscle twitching minutely in her cheek, the Sendai settlement, I mean, a swing and a miss, Lelouch considered, noting how the stress had ebbed completely from Callan's voice. It seemed like the option most obvious to a radical part-time journalist with access to the internet, though. If I wanted support for an anti-Britannian insurgent group in Japan, and especially if I had sympathy for an empire purporting to hold the freedom of the press as sacred, I would reach out to the European-aligned groups operating out of Vladivostok long before I went south to find an agent of the Chinese-backed government in exile. Which, he concluded, likely means that this isn't connected to her actions as a rebel, and so the signature on the letter is presumably authentic. Well, in any case, Lelouch levered himself back upright in his chair and flipped the ink pad open again, reaching for his stamp. Kindly pass on my regards to Baron New Leicester and a welcome on behalf of the Ashford Academy Student Council to Area 11. He brought the stamp down on first the letter, then its envelope with a muted thump-thump before slipping the former back into the latter and tossing the result into his out tray where it ceased to be his problem. Now, Lelouch continued, his anxiety ebbing minutely at the sensation of completing something in his ever-mounting pile of responsibilities, was there anything else I could help you with, Callan? If not, well. He motioned vaguely toward his mountain of paperwork and then the door she had entered from. I wish you a thoroughly enjoyable and informative sabbatical. Callan followed his hand enough to glance at the door, but she remained firmly rooted in place across his desk. Actually, she said, turning to look back at the door again, there was one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Lelouch. Oh? Palms itching once more, and damn Callan and her hot and cold attitude, Lelouch forced a smile equal parts welcoming and helpful. What would that be? A few months back, when I was first invited to join the student council, Callan grimaced slightly, presumably at the memory of what had preceded that invitation. You mentioned that you'd edited my files? Lelouch very carefully didn't let his eyes narrow or his smile stiffen. Of all the things he could have asked about. Why this one? On the Ashford Academy server, yes, he confirmed, nodding authoritatively. As I explained, the Ministry of Education's database updates automatically, drawing from the databases of each constituent educational institute in the area. Right, Callan nodded, I remember that. And that's as far as you went when you were correcting my files, right? Just using Millie's credentials to get into the Academy's servers and letting the Ministry's own automatic update handle the rest? She's trying to maneuver me into admitting something, Lelouch realized. Quite audacious of her. But why? Blackmailing me over the database tampering is a losing proposition for her. Doing so would expose the edits I made, drawing undue attention to her heritage and activities in Shinjuku. Even if her father's connections are enough to protect her, it would gain her nothing and cost a great deal to hush the matter up. More or less, Lelouch admitted, smiling ruefully. Honestly, it was pretty easy to do. For all that people like to think of hacking as something magical or whatnot, mostly it just involves exploiting flaws in a system's security. That or finding shortcuts some lazy user already made for their own use. That's it? Callan looked crestfallen. Just a simple trick like that. That's. She tilted her head to the side, clearly considering something less impressive than I'd expected, I guess. Immediately, Lelouch was forced to wrestle with his pride for control over his tongue. A simple trick. He raged in the security of his skull. You, as an insurgent and a rebel hiding herself behind the mask of a schoolgirl, should understand the advantage of securing a key piece of intelligence to exploit a systemic weakness. Then he saw the smile. It was only barely noticeable, just a slight upward bowing of her lips, but it was there on Lady Callan Stadtfeld's face. And it was smug. She's trying to bait me again. The thought splashed over his inflamed pride like ice water, permitting him control over his faculties once more. Perhaps bait is the wrong word, or at least it might be more adversarial than what she has in mind. I myself noted that Callan's skills represent a significant enough value that recruitment is worth pursuing. Perhaps she's reciprocating to some degree or is considering what value I could provide? As I said, Lelouch began, a patently guileless smile spread across his face. It certainly isn't magic by any stretch. Just a relatively simple process. That said, I did a bit more. Just to maintain consistency, you see. It wouldn't have done for some clerk at the Ministry of Education to one day realize your medical records on file diverged significantly from those kept by the Ministry of Health. To that end, a bit of clean-up was necessary. A file here or there. Nothing too major. I see. Callan nodded, mulling that over. That was a good move, Lelouch. Good thinking. Oh, you know, Lelouch said, allowing a touch of well-deserved pride to touch his voice, I am capable of a bit of foresight every now and again. Not that you would know it, looking at my entree. He forced a laugh at the richly humorous observation, joined briefly by a pity chuckle from Callan. But seriously, he continued, you can rest easy about your digital profile. It is entirely consistent with what you and I understand to be your history, Callan, your chronic health issues, your biography. Everything's been handled. You can rest easy on that score, and, Lelouch smiled, hoping it came off as warmly sympathetic, you can rest knowing that not a single mention of Shinjuku is present in connection to any file with your name on it. Nor on any of the backups. Consistency, after all, must be maintained. Ah, Callan sighed, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, an entirely natural smile found its way to her. To Lelouch, it looked like a knot of tension had eased in the perpetually on-edge Stadtfeld. That's a relief. Thanks, I guess. Lelouch. It was my pleasure, Callan, Lelouch replied with complete sincerity. Throwing grit into the gears of the administration was its own reward. Now, if there isn't anything else. So, she interrupted, and though the smile was still there, it looked decidedly sharper now. Hungry. And this time, it wasn't his palms that itched, no, this time it was his ankles, as if he had just set his foot into a bear trap and felt the triggering pan under his foot tremble. Can you enter the Ministry of Justice's servers and edit the contents of their database as well, Lelouch? After all, Callan pressed on relentlessly, raising her voice over his silence, You did just admit to infiltrating the Ministry of Health as well as the Ministry of Education. So what's one more scalp for your belt, Mr. Vice President? Lelouch instantly clamped down on the knee-jerk panic flooding his system. Keep calm, he told himself, ice water running through his veins, feeling the steel jaws trembling with tension, eager to snap shut on the leg he had shoved down his throat. She's fishing. She has no evidence. More likely than not, this is her paranoia speaking. She must think that I have set her up for failure when someone notices that the Ministry of Justice files are different from every other governmental file pertaining to her. Which would be a reasonable fear if I had not, in fact, edited the Ministry of Justice's files. After copying them for myself, of course. They were both extensive and overly protected for the daughter of a mere baron. It would be extremely difficult to infiltrate the Ministry of Justice, Lelouch said, resorting to the truth. They maintain a rigorous cybersecurity regime, at least for a governmental institution. Why do you ask, Callan? Just recently, I was interrogated in regards to unauthorized changes made to my ministry file, Callan revealed, no trace of a smile on her face, only a razor-edged intensity and a terrifying coldness behind her eyes. Lelouch's gaze darted to her hands again and found them still thankfully empty of weapons. Naturally, as soon as someone started asking about recent updates to my files, I thought of you. Hopefully you kept those thoughts to yourself, snapped Lelouch, the sudden terror at the prospect that Lelouch Lamperouge had come to the attention of the security services entirely overwhelming his rational fear of the insurgent before him. Whoever it was who interrogated you was lying. I was not joking in the slightest when I said that the Ministry of Justice takes cybersecurity seriously. The only people who have full access to the edit history and the metadata of a biographic file are the members of the Technical Services Division and high-ranking ministerial personnel. I doubt any would have the time or interest to interrogate a baron's daughter sneaking out to the ghetto, Callan. For a moment, the air between them thrummed with tension. Lelouch couldn't help but curse himself for his slip-up. He was trying to build rapport with Callan, to convince her of his utility. If he could join forces with her and her mysterious Japanese connections. Snapping at her served none of his goals. But apologizing now will convey weakness. The training he had received at court was quite clear on that point. The only thing worse than making a mistake was publicly admitting to your error. Weakness be damned, screamed another corner of his mind. What do you think you're doing here? She's dangerous. What, would you go back on your promise and leave Nunnally all alone over a point of pride? And yet, his tongue was leaden, the apology choked behind his lips. Thankfully, it proved unnecessary. Just as Callan began to grudgingly nod her acceptance of the point, the door to the student council room banged open, shocking Lelouch to his feet and sending Callan spinning around into a combat stance, center of gravity low and arms spread wide. Millie? Lelouch and Callan chorused, identifying the panting intruder. What are you doing here? Both said as one, before exchanging surprised looks at the momentary synchronization. You know, I was about to ask that, said Millie, looking from one face to the other. I didn't expect to find anybody here but Lulu. Hello Callan, she continued, turning fully toward Callan and bobbing a brief curtsy. It's good to see you again. Are we still on for tea tomorrow? True to the promise she had made via Lelouch, Millie had remained almost painfully respectful and courteous in all of her interactions with Callan since the other girl had joined the student council as the ROTC's representative. Privately, Millie had confessed that the self-censoring this policy required remained something of a strain on her willpower, but to Lelouch it seemed like the effort was already paying off. Callan had remained true to her word as well and had met Millie halfway, allowing the president to address her by name instead of Lady Callan after a week. Now the two of them are practically friends, Lelouch thought, almost smiling, or as close to friends as Callan's circumstances allow. Which means that she might hesitate for a few heartbeats before knifing Millie. Joy. Sorry Millie, but I'll have to cancel, replied Callan, pairing the remark with a regretful smile as she drew herself up from her stance, brushing her bangs back out of her eyes. You can ask Lelouch for the details, but I'll be elsewhere for the remainder of the summer. Actually, She looked down at her wristwatch. I should be heading out, I need to pack my bags. Oh. Millie blinked. Well, in that case, have a good trip. May, Callan grunted in a distinctly unladylike, if not unkind, fashion. By Millie, Lelouch. I'll see you in the fall. Goodbye, Millie replied to Callan's retreating back, with Lelouch repeating her farewell a heartbeat later, adding enjoy your tour. For good measure. Just as Callan's hand fell on the handle of the still open door, she paused and turned back. Oh, that reminds me, do either of you know where Rivals is? I've got one last goodbye to say before I leave. Probably still in the automotive club's garage, Lelouch said, helpfully adding, he said something about tuning up his bike for a ride this afternoon. Not that I'm letting him get out of his filing duties that easily. I see, Callan replied. Thanks, Lelouch. You've been quite helpful. And then she was gone, the door swinging quietly shut in her wake. With the click of the latch, Lelouch sank back down into his chair, sparing his still crowded tray a gloomy look before glancing up at Millie, who was still eyeing the door, worrying at her lip with her teeth. Apparently Callan's father has come to visit, Lelouch said, answering the unspoken question as Millie turned to face him. He apparently wants to spend the summer touring Japan with his daughter. Callan's dad is here? Millie asked, surprise writ large across her face. The Baron of New Leicester? That's honestly not as out of character as I first thought. At Lelouch's inquisitive look, she elaborated. I mean, he recognized Callan as his heiress, despite her heritage, long before anybody could have guessed that she'd be a genius in a nightmare simulator. He must care for her as his child. If he didn't, he could have taken a few fertile wives and made some trueborn scions. It's not like there's any doubt that Callan's his daughter, not unless her mother was sleeping with his brothers or something. The family resemblance is far too strong for it to be anything else. Which he presumably would have noticed, Lelouch replied lightly, ignoring the way his gut seized halfway through Millie's explanation. So him flying halfway across the world is not out of character on the grounds that he actually wanted to spend quality time with his daughter. Sometimes the simplest answer makes the most sense, Millie replied, no matter how strange to us the concepts might be. Lelouch carefully didn't acknowledge the way Millie's face had tightened as she spoke, nor how hollow her familiar laughing smile, returned once Callan had left, had grown. Though it wasn't his business, he knew that some tension had entered the lives of the Ashford family once Reuben had proclaimed his granddaughter as his heiress, rather than his son. It wasn't his business how Millie's relationship with her parents had developed in the wake of that announcement, and he doubted she would appreciate him involving himself in the matter. He also carefully didn't notice how she had included him in her last statement. Some things were left best unsaid, and some scars weren't to be picked at. Putting Callan and her fascinating dynamic with her father aside, he said instead, "What was it you wanted? Surely you almost rushed face first into Callan for a reason." Eh? Millie blinked again, shook her head, and smiled again, returning to the track of comfortable conversation. Oh, right. She pointed an accusing finger across the desk. You haven't been answering your phone, Lulu. He hesitated, glancing guiltily at the drawer he had crammed his phone into after he'd read Nunnally's text. I wanted to minimize distractions, he extemporized, waving at his burdened desk. There is a great deal that requires our attention, and I for one want to catch up on the paperwork as soon as is feasible. Liar, Millie replied, offhandedly dismissive. You were nagging Nunnally again, weren't you? Lelouch gritted his teeth, feeling his upset stomach churn at the mention of his sister's name. If there is even a trace of a burn on her face, Sayoko had best prepare to give an account of herself. Unable to defend himself against Millie's knowing smirk, Lelouch opted for an offensive instead. Did you come here for a purpose or not? He asked irritably. If you just came here to disrupt council business, Madam President, then I'm sure you wouldn't mind reviewing the latest outlays filed by the landscapers. Who could have guessed that constructing a nightmare maneuver course on short notice and maintaining the blasted thing would cost extra? Sounds important. Millie cheerfully replied with an impudent smile. I sure am lucky to have such a capable and dedicated fiancé to handle it all, aren't I, Leland? Not here, Millie, Lelouch chided, eyes darting instinctually towards the closed door. Look, you surely had a reason to come disturb my work, out with it. Ah. And suddenly, Lelouch noted, Millie's smile didn't look quite as vivacious as usual, nor as sincere. Lelouch. You really should pay more attention to your phone. The hairs on the back of Lelouch's neck rose as Millie's smile faded rapidly away. Seeing the wet pearls beading in the corners of her eyes, Lelouch kept his voice gentle and soft as he asked, What did I miss, Millie? Philip's been trying to get a hold of you for half an hour, Millie replied, her voice brittle with checked emotion threatening to slip her control. When you didn't answer, he called me instead. Philip? Lelouch frowned at the name of his first acquaintance among the true Anglicans, the one who had shared his book of rituals with him the night of the first post-trivia service. What was he looking for? It's... Millie drew in a breath, hands curling into fists by her side. It's time, Lelouch. Old Tim. He couldn't get out of bed this morning, and according to Philip, he's having trouble breathing. He's barely awake, but... He asked for you. She looked away, licked her lips, and forced her eyes back onto Lelouch's. He wants you to say the words over him. Once again, the old man was right, Lelouch marveled. It looks like he will not be seeing August after all, just as he said. And just as he said, he is passing his mantle over to me. This time for keeps, this time in the eyes of the congregation. By saying the words over his body at his request, my leadership over the church will be set in stone. My time has come. The thought was supposed to have been triumphant. Finally he would achieve a place of power. This was to be the moment where he tasted victory. Instead all he tasted was ash. I see, he said out loud, feeling a weight hanging from his back as he climbed to his feet, the same weight he had carried since he walked through a dead city 6 years back. Call Philip back, please, Millie. Let him know. He hesitated, then committed. Let him know that I'm on my way. Will do, Millie nodded. Some reason you're not calling him yourself? Yes, Lelouch smiled thinly back, opening the desk drawer and retrieving his phone. I doubt Sayoko will accept a call from another number and, before I do this, I need to let Nunnally know. She has demanded updates on any major developments. His smile tightened. I would say this counts. Ah, said Millie, instant understanding flooding her eyes as she nodded again, clearly in favor of anything that saved her from another velvet soft, razor-edged dressing down, courtesy of the younger Vi Britannia. I'll just step out to let Philip know, then, shall I? Lelouch nodded absently, scarcely noticing when she left the council room. This is not a final victory, he knew, not even as the undisputed master of the true Anglicans. But Father Timothy has set the stage for me to cement their loyalty to me, first as Brother Alexander, and perhaps eventually as their true prince. Not my final victory. But at last, I have a weapon I can use against that man. At last, I have found people who hate him just as much as I. All I have to do now is turn that discontentment and rage into a dagger to drive right through his rotten spine. As Lelouch thumbed Sayoko's number into his phone, raising the device to his ear just in time to hear Nunnally's protector pick up on the first ring, he didn't realize that he was grinning until he heard the smile in his own voice. July 31, 2016 ATP, Albert's Tap House, Kita Ward, Tokyo Settlement, 2000. Curtains drawn. The dingy room over the tap house was stiflingly hot in the absence of any stray breezes that might break up the sultry evening air. Turning impotently, an ancient rotary fan oscillated from side to side, the decrepit motor barely strong enough to move its blades. From the corner of the room, an equally old standing lamp shed just enough light to qualify the impromptu office as dimly lit. All of this was immaterial to Lelouch. He was, at the moment, entirely fixated on his laptop and the evening's operation, already well underway. Compared to playing cat and mouse with the Ministry of Justice's anti-infiltration measures, cracking the servers of the Diocese of Tokyo had been child's play. Almost before the operation began, Lelouch had spread their contents wide open, ready for his perusal. The security measures guarding the database of the Britannic Church in Area 11 were adequate at best, their limited effectiveness degraded by diocesan staff who took digital security guidelines as suggestions and who updated their security software on a schedule best described as haphazard. After all, why wouldn't they be smugly complacent? Lelouch grinned to himself, watching as his rootkit finished installing itself and began loading a prepared list of account numbers. Who would steal from the church, after all? If not for the risk of their eternal soul, surely fear of Lazaro Pulst's vengeance would cower any would-be thieves. Sadly for them, His Eminence will soon be beyond such petty mortal disputes. Almost before Father Timothy's body had time to cool in its grave, unmarked by the side of the Chiba road save for an unpainted cross, Lelouch had put the first steps of his new plan into motion. For the moment, he had momentum on his side. Father Timothy's last request had passed the mantle of leadership to him in as smooth of a succession as any underground group could hope for. Lelouch had spent every available minute of the last 2 weeks taking merciless advantage of the old man's legacy, traveling to every fractured cell and clandestine congregation in the Tokyo region to reintroduce himself as the new head of the true Anglican congregation. For the most part, this announcement had been met with acquiescence. Lelouch had met most of the congregation before and formed personal connections with as many leading figures in the disparate fragments as he could. Now, he drew upon those connections and upon the work he had done on behalf of each congregation, pointing out when he had sourced funds for new clothes or anticongestants during hay fever season, or when he had helped write a letter to the electric company clarifying the matter of an unpaid bill after the power to a congregant's apartment had been shut off. And for now, his inherited authority was holding. For now. The dual flaws in the foundation of his inherited priestly authority were blatant to Lelouch and, he was certain, to his followers. Well-spoken and intelligent though he was both not a priest and still only 16. This later fact wasn't known to his followers, but they all knew that he was young, far younger than most of them. He was, in short, riding toward an authority shortfall. Short of somehow becoming ordained in the defunct pre-Archbishop Warren Britannic Church, drastic measures were necessary. Besides, Lelouch admitted to himself, toying with a pen as white text scrolled faster than the eye could follow across his console, there is only so long a revolutionary movement, or really a reactionary movement, can squat in a basement before it loses any vigor it may have once possessed. Better to burn the powder now than wait for it to degrade entirely. From that seed, Lelouch's plan had sprung. He had no priestly credentials to fall back upon, nor the appearance of wisdom and temperance that Father Timothy's advanced age and years on the run had brought the old man. He would have to manufacture his own authority through actions, through victories, through giving the double handful of people who were his now fresh hope. Hope not only of survival, but hope that their long-awaited triumph would soon stoop upon the earth. There was really only one target suitable to deliver all of that. And by happy coincidence, that target is perhaps the only man holding Clovis's entire rotten administration together. Only to advance his own graft, but the sheer power vacuum his absence would open is guaranteed to prompt infighting. By not so sheer coincidence, that same target had been the subject of Lelouch's thankfully forgotten abortive poster campaign. Lazaro Pulst, Bishop of Tokyo and Minister of Economic Development. The vice-regal governor's economic advisor and the widely hated fattest man in Area 11 made for a natural target, but one too well protected for his legion of malcontents to do anything but mutter about. Or that had been the case until Lelouch had brought organization and planning to the members of his congregation most willing to risk direct action. The first stage of his plan to topple the fattest man from his episcopal throne had been inspired by Callan. Her curiosity regarding his hacks into the administration's various databases had lit the spark. Almost on an impulse, Lelouch had tried his hand at cracking into the diocese's financial database. The dummy donation he made to the Widows and Orphans Fund, complete with an almost unnoticeable worm piggybacking on the entry, had, to his muted surprise, led to the discovery of a veritable world of graft. And the embezzlement of donations and smudged lines between the diocesan coffers and the bishop's personal accounts had only been the start of what Lelouch had found in his first dive into the thoroughly cooked church books. Over a fevered, sleepless night, he traced accounts, cross-referenced names against recent news items from the society page, and, later, checked for some of those same entries in digitized police blotters and army incident records. The scale of it is shocking, he had told Nunnally and Millie over coffee, though the content is sadly typically exploitative. Trafficking in conscripted 11s, buying up debts owed by poor citizens and immediately declaring the markers due, operating multiple brothels. None of that is particularly shocking, not really, not to anybody with even the most cursory of windows into the sleaze oozing below the settlement's gilded facade. Rather, the sheer scope of the operation is the surprise here, and how hollowed out the diocese has truly become. Truthfully, I think that Pulst and his ilk simply grew too greedy in their efforts to skim the fat, and now the church here in Area 11 is little but a carcass. Only the bloat of its own rot gives it any substance, held in check only by a thin skin of propriety. Lelouch had shook his head, almost dismayed by his own findings. Pulst is sitting on a bomb, and I doubt he has even the slightest of clues. So, what are you going to do? Millie had asked curiously. Gonna leak it to the press or something? Prick the skin and pop the bubble all over the fattest man in Tokyo's face? Why bother? Lelouch had snorted. Vice-regal Governor La Bretagne effectively owns all the press in the area, so I doubt any would be interested in running the story. Sending it back across the Pacific would be equally pointless. The entire story is local to Area 11, so nobody who matters in the homeland will care. The news is always quite complimentary of Brother Clovis, Nunnally had sighed, gently replacing her teacup on its saucer. Still though, brother, I am sure you have no intention of giving up and allowing this abuse to continue, do you? His darling sister's comment had only technically been a question. The implicit command had been as clear as it was already unnecessary. After all, Lelouch thought, mentally patting himself on the back as he typed in the next string in his prepared list into the prompt, when a man as important as his rotundity offers up such a plum opportunity, it would be rude to refuse. The real question, he had found, was what to do with the remaining funds in the diocese's coffers and slush funds. His initial knee-jerk response had been to divert them into one of his own illicit accounts. Stolen church money could cover his and Nunnally's expenses for a very long time, to say nothing of improving the lots of his parishioners. His second thought had been on how easily traceable such digital diversions of funds were, especially if the exchequer smelled an opportunity to appropriate untaxed and dirty money for their own ends. As Nunnally had provided the question, she likewise also provided the answer. Give it away, his darling sister had said after he laid out his predicament, looking up from her muesli to smile at him from long habit, her forever closed eyes oriented just to his right. It was donated to the church in the name of protecting the helpless and needy, was it not? Send it where it was meant to go. What makes you think that the administration would allow whichever lucky charities benefit from the surprise donation to keep their new wealth? Lelouch had inquired, mildly incredulous at the suggestion. Absolutely nothing, dear brother, Nunnally had replied with a sharper smile. Other than how much our dear brother Clovis wishes to be seen as a kind and benevolent prince. As you mentioned, he owns the area's media, and they cannot cease singing the praises of his humanitarian deeds. No doubt at his prompting. A kind and benevolent prince does not snatch bread from the mouths of poor veterans and orphans, at least not where there is any chance someone might find out. And with that, the next piece of the plan had clicked into place. Dirty laundry aired, funds distributed to the poor, and the third, all-important, leg of the plan. Which, Lelouch glanced down to the corner of the screen, checking the time, should be reaching its crescendo any minute now. Somewhere in the massive pile of steel, glass, and concrete that enjoyed the name of the bishop's palace, built adjacent to the equally ugly Tokyo Cathedral and only a stone's throw from the viceregal palace in the heart of the Britannian concession, the last stages of that third leg would be unfolding. Havelock, his old trivia partner, had shaved his easily identifiable sideburns and donned a carefully crafted replica of the uniform worn by diocesan stewards. Even now, he would be padding through the no doubt decadently decorated hallways of the bishop's private apartments, pushing a cart laden with freshly laundered bedding. Wrapped around his narrow waist below the steward's tailcoat was a sedated Western taipan, straight from Area 9 and freshly liberated from the Clove Island Zoo reptile house. In just under 2 hours, the sedatives will wear off. Lelouch was quite certain of that point. He had been the one to calculate the dosage necessary to incapacitate the incredibly deadly reptile and had been in the room when the snake had been very carefully injected with the pilfered drug. By which point Havelock should have long since made the bishop's bed and continued on with his rounds, just another servant among hundreds. Assuming Pulst's nighttime entertainments conclude before midnight, he'll be leaving the concession just as Pulst is slipping between the sheets. It was not the most practical of plans, Lelouch could freely admit as much. It would have been much simpler to rig a grenade below the bishop's official vehicle or, if push came to shove, to simply shoot the cleric in mid-sermon. But in such matters, optics are everything. Blowing Pulst up would be a mere political act, while desecrating a chapel, even a state church chapel, with bloodshed would elevate Pulst's name posthumously on the wings of martyrdom. Being bit by a snake, however, the archetypal symbol of evil and corruption. Lips quirked in a cruel smile, gone in a flash. Well, that's just the devil taking his due, isn't it? In Lelouch's opinion, it was an easy narrative to follow and to understand, with undeniable symbolism and a clear message. It was also a clear attack on the legitimacy of the Britannic Church, and thus would certainly be covered up by the official media to the greatest extent possible. Which was why Lelouch had no intention of conceding control over the narrative to the viceregal governor's lickspittles. The door to the sweltering apartment over the bar creaked open and Millie slipped inside, closing the door behind her. And speaking of narrative control. "Ah, Millie," Lelouch said, glancing up from his laptop to greet his confederate. "Is it ready?" Wordlessly, the Ashford heiress placed a small drive down on his temporary desk, the aluminum casing clicking against scored wood. "It's here," she confirmed, her voice uncharacteristically toneless. "Just as you asked." Frowning, Lelouch looked back up from his computer and gave Millie a critical once-over. In the room's poor lighting, she scarcely looked herself. Beyond her guise as Millie Ashland, she looks tired and anxious. Lelouch couldn't blame her. It was only natural for a young lady shielded from the fullness of court life to blanch at premeditated murder. "It will be all right, Millie," he said reassuringly, standing from his chair and pacing around the desk to stand beside her, half to convey his support and half to massage life back into his cramped legs after too long behind his screen. "I am certain you did an excellent job with the credit and denunciation video. You really do have a knack for this kind of work. You'll definitely be a wonderful anchorwoman someday." Millie forced a tremulous smile. "Thanks, Lulu. But..." The smile cracked. "That's not really why I'm concerned." "Oh?" Lelouch quirked an eyebrow, remaining confident though he felt a sudden wave of concern at the prospect that he had overlooked something. "What's the matter then, Millie? Everything's going smoothly so far." He paused, then added more gently, "Having second thoughts, pray?" "Yeah," Millie sighed at the admission and turned slightly so she could rest against the edge of the desk. A moment later, Lelouch joined her, holding his tongue in companionable silence. "It's not Pulst that's making me worry," she said after a quiet minute had passed. "As a man, he's absolute garbage. What he's done, the abuses he's committed, facilitated, and covered up." She pulled a face, a grotesque expression of theatrical disgust. "We should be applauded for killing him. It's a public service, really. The prospect of becoming accessory to a murder doesn't trouble you?" Lelouch asked, gently prodding as Millie fell silent again. "Make no mistake, I would not hold it against you if it did." After all, he reflected, It's also my first time being directly responsible for the death of another human being. I wonder if my lack of feeling about that should be a cause for concern? Pulst has a family, presumably, even corrupt, bloviating bastards have those. Perhaps they will miss him, but I simply cannot bring myself to feel any regret for their loss. Well, I'm not thrilled about it, Millie admitted, grimacing slightly. But no, at the end of the day, there's just some people the world could do without, and I think he's one of them. Lelouch nodded carefully, keeping quiet. Something was clearly weighing down on Millie, and if it wasn't the murder, then she had yet to mention what the real source of her concerns was. Hell, the only one I'm worried for tonight, right at this moment is Havelock, Millie continued, looking up at the water-stained ceiling as she spoke. Assuming the snake doesn't bite him or nobody realizes that he's not actually on the staff, he should be all right. It would be really unlucky if a random police patrol picked him up on the way home, but he should be okay. Havelock knows what he's doing, Lelouch said soothingly. All of his papers are in order, he's got more than enough cash on hand to handle any shakedowns, and I even made sure he knows how to apply the false sideburns he'll be wearing for the next few days. He also knows exactly what is expected of him in the event that some unforeseen factor complicates his escape beyond recovery. Even knowing full well what would have to be done, he still volunteered. And all he requested was that I say the last words with him before he left this afternoon. Yeah, Millie agreed, he'll be fine, for today at least, probably. But, she looked back toward Lelouch, meeting his eyes squarely, what about tomorrow? Or a month from now? What about everybody else? Impossible to say, Lelouch conceded. The church already has plenty of experience keeping a low profile and relying on codes and signs to pass messages, but if the security services actually take an interest in us, who knows how effective those will be? The Bureau setting up a permanent field office down in Hiroshima is undeniably worrying, but the other option is just to continue hiding until we dwindle into irrelevancy. Ultimately, he shrugged, I can plan as much as I like, but I cannot see the future, Millie. I'm not really saying this right, Millie mumbled, then sighed with exasperation. I get all that. I know all that. I heard you say as much to Nunnally, remember? Look, I'm not worried about our physical safety. Well, she caveated, I am, but that's not. She shook her head vigorously, carefully pinned blonde tresses escaping their bindings, and turned back to fix Lelouch with a skewering focus. Look, Lulu, I just gotta ask. Do you think what we're doing here is right? You said it yourself, didn't you? Killing Pulst would be a public service. But Lelouch frowned, peering into Millie's cornflower blue eyes. This isn't about Pulst, is it? Who cares about that tub of lard? Millie snorted dismissively, before quickly sobering up once more. No, Lelouch, I'm talking about how we are manipulating the members of the church. I mean. She took a breath, held it, and exhaled. I mean, do you really believe all of this? Not just the God stuff, but that the true Anglicans will ever return to power? True prince or not, Leland, you've got to admit that an actual victory like that is a very long shot, but you're selling it as an inevitability. Selling them hope is what you're doing, and I don't know if you have any intention of ever delivering. And that's Millie Ashford right there, Lelouch thought, calmly meeting his friend's imploring eyes. She likes to have fun, likes to tease and play jokes, but at the end of the day she's an intensely caring person. Moreover, she's an intensely responsible person, once she moves past her jokes and recognizes her responsibility. It seems like she's taken responsibility for the welfare of the congregation, and probably because she helped recruit some of them, a sense of responsibility for my promises. If not handled delicately, this could be an issue. Big questions indeed, Millie, he said at last, unflinchingly meeting her gaze. Truthfully, I have been struggling with some of them myself. Pushing off of the desk, Lelouch rose to his full height and stretched, rolling his shoulders back as he tried to loosen his back after hours hunching over his laptop, buying time in the process, Starting from the easiest question. I'd say I'm ambivalent on the God stuff, as you put it. Whether or not there is a God or an afterlife matters very little when Britannia is free to do as it wishes in this life. I won't lie, the prospect of that man spending the remainder of eternity burning in hell is pleasing, but ultimately it matters very little. God, I assume, Lelouch added, will presumably tend to that while leaving the small matter of sending that man to his just reward up to me. I don't think there is a God, Millie admitted, almost offhandedly, and then looked shocked at her own words. It's just. If there is, he doesn't really seem to do very much, does he? And if that's the case, well, isn't that basically the same as there not being one at all? I will admit that it is difficult to argue that point, Lelouch chuckled, before continuing. As for the real meat of your questions, about whether or not I am deceiving the true Anglicans, I do not believe that I am. You think you can win? Millie's voice was incredulously flat. How can I believe otherwise and still function? Lelouch asked, an old weight hanging on his back, his stomach knotting with a hunger long since sated and nostrils full of the remembered scent of corpses sweltering in the summer's heat. If I cannot win, if the world truly is immovable and cruel, if there is no chance of ever tearing down Britannia and building a world worthy of Nunnally from the ashes, then why bother getting up each morning? That's not an answer, Millie accused. It's inspirational, sure, but an affirmation isn't an answer. True, Lelouch nodded, it isn't. But like you said, a final triumph is a long shot. We have to have hope, and hope is built from the belief that there is a chance of victory. Do I believe that triumph is inevitable? No, but that does not mean that I am any less dedicated to doing all in my power to pave a road toward that glorious conclusion. Do I think it is probable that the true Anglicans shall again preach from the pulpit of Rochester Cathedral? It is not probable, but it is possible. You are right, Millie, in your silent but pertinent point. I am manipulating the true Anglicans. But I ask you, do you think that they don't know this? Don't accept this? They know just as well as you or I how many they number, how scarce their resources are. They know that victory is a dream, at least for now. But that hope I sell them is the same hope I feel, the same hope I sell myself. I know how great and terrible that man is, Millie, and I know how cold, uncaring, and awful the world can be. But, Lelouch continued, his voice quieting, losing none of its vigor as volume bled away, I will not give up. One way or another, either I will die or I will be victorious. Britannia will burn, Millie, or I will burn myself up. Too much has happened. Too much cannot be undone. If I am selling hope to the true Anglicans, then it is only because I am hooked on that same hope already. Call me a liar for telling them that they will be the winners when this all shakes out, but then I am a liar twice over because that is the same lie I tell myself whenever I gaze into a mirror. Pausing, Lelouch looked away from Millie, giving himself some time to collect himself as the previous silence returned to the room. It thickened in the sultry air as Lelouch waited for his co-conspirator's reply, seeming to condense into some dreadful unseen fog as the long seconds ticked by. When he could stand it no longer, Lelouch mustered up his courage and, dragging his eyes back down to hers, asked, "Does that answer your question?" Why, Millie stopped, her voice quavering and her eyes wide and staring, as if she had never seen him before, and coughed. "Yeah," she tried again, "it does. Phew." A hint of a smile, a touch of a blush, and something like her usual mischievous sparkle returned to Millie as she took a deep, heaving breath. "You sure do talk fancy, Mr. Leland." Her lips parted into a devil-may-care grin. "You always have dreamt big, haven't you? Geez. Well, there's worse ambitions for a son of Britannia, I suppose. After all, isn't it the most Britannian ambition of all to destroy Britannia once and for all?" Lelouch stifled the flinch that last comment evoked. The idea that everything he was doing was only playing into the lies that man spread about the nature of humanity, the nature of Britannia. He pushed the disconcerting thought away entirely and focused back on Millie. At least Millie saw he wanted to destroy the throne instead of claiming it for himself. That was something. "All that aside," he said, "are you still with me, Millie?" You asked if I was certain that I can deliver victory, and I have admitted that I am not. Does that shake your confidence? If you want out, I will not hold it against you. Oh, you're not escaping our engagement that easily, Leland Millie sang back, Ashford peeping through Ashland even as she clung to her disguise's backstory. Sorry, but you're stuck with me. From now until the end, I guess. Keep up with the jokes, Lelouch replied with a smile, stepping back and away from Millie to return to his computer, checking on his program's progress. It's good for morale. But, Millie? He looked back up, catching her eyes once again. Thank you. You and your family have done so much, so very much, for us. It will not be forgotten, I promise you. You make a lot of promises, Millie mused, rising from the desk. But I'll take your word on it. A smile touched her lips as she turned toward the door, Lelouch only catching a glimpse of the expression. Lord Lelouch. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. A joke, Lelouch knew, and knew that it wasn't. Several minutes after Millie left, Lelouch's phone pulsed against the side of his leg. Havelock? He said, recognizing the number. How was your shift? Complete to dogshit, came the reassuring counter-phrase, affirming that, paradoxically, all was well. Just another day on deck, you know how it goes. Having to deal with another smug pig in a suit working us boys to the bone. Just stepped out for a smoke break to see how the kiddos are. Polly's well, Lelouch replied, informing him that the first prong of the offensive, the hack, was already well underway. Megan's just gone to bed. The second prong was ready for deployment. Well, at least there's that, Havelock said, relieved, and Lelouch heard the sound of a lighter clicking in the background as Havelock made good on his cover. Ah, hits the spot, that. Long shift tonight. Miguel was shifty as hell tonight, but I saw him off just fine. Hopefully that holds. The snake was in the bishop's bed and the sedation had already been wearing off when Havelock had put it there. Nobody had noticed that anything was amiss yet. That's good, Lelouch said, feeling quite relieved himself. So far, everything was going splendidly. Well, hang in there. You don't have much longer left on the clock, so just keep your head down and stay away from that guy. He's a troublemaker. He hesitated, then asked, do you need a ride home? Stay in place for the remainder of your scheduled shift, and leave with the rest of the evening shift when they clock out. Do nothing to draw attention to yourself. Are you on track for exfiltration? Nah, Havelock demurred, I'll be taking the train home. Smells like piss, but it gets the job done it? All right, Lelouch nodded, hang in there. See you back at the bar, first round's on me. Hanging up, Lelouch turned back to the computer and busied himself preparing Millie's video for distribution, giving it a quick viewing himself. It was short, only a few minutes long, but it was quite punchy. It aped the ritual of excommunication, listing Pulst's many and varied sins while flashing between photos of news items, shots of the crooked ledgers, and numbers and names of those wronged by Pulst, before building to a thundering climax, first declaring Pulst defrocked and expelled from the company of the saved, then levying a forced penance upon him. Blood shall pay for blood, and only blood shall wipe away your sin, Lazaro Pulst. Millie really does good work, Lelouch thought, uploading the video to a blind server located in Australia before mirroring the video to a number of servers distributed across the EU and the Britannian heartland areas. And of course, so does Nunnally. Nobody would think that the thundering voice came from a wheelchair-bound 13-year-old girl with a voice changer. Maybe she's got a career in voice acting? As the computer dinged a merry notification that the uploads were complete, Lelouch pulled the virtual machine he was running the hack from back onto his screen. A quick check proved that all was ready. A single keystroke would lock the diocese's servers, giving Lelouch's manufactured credentials administrator privileges and stripping access from all other accounts. Another keystroke would initiate millions of involuntary micro-donations from the Diocese of Tokyo to 30 selected charities, each transferring between £1 and £10. Each donation would be made out in honor of Timothy Hamilton, late of Bainbridge. And with the tap of enter, Lelouch thought, smiling as he pressed that key. "I have eviscerated the bishopric of Tokyo. Now," he thought, minimizing the window as he began uploading his collection of evidence of the crimes of Lazaro Pulse to a number of file-sharing sites, to salt the wound. The door to the office swung back open, and to Lelouch's surprise, Millie re-entered the room, pushing a rolling office chair laden with a light blanket ahead of her. "Millie?" Lelouch asked, blinking at the intrusion. "I thought you had left." "Why would you think something as silly as that, Leland?" came the arch reply. "What kind of fiancé would I be if I left my man all alone in the office, slaving over a hot computer? A perfectly ordinary person with her own life to lead?" Lelouch tried, before sighing. "You know, it's just us here. Even Fred's gone home for the night. You can let the joke rest for now." Millie put a finger to her lips and made a production of looking upwards, miming contemplation. "Nah," she said at last, scooting her chair up beside Lelouch's. "You're already too serious, Lulu, and if I can't force you into a dress for a cross-dresser's ball, I'll have to resort to the next best option." "Pretending that we're together?" Lelouch asked wryly as Millie shook the blanket out. "Tame by your standards, Millie." "Who said I'm pretending?" she rejoined, dropping down into her chair. Somehow, she had maneuvered it behind the desk so it directly abutted Lelouch's own tired swivel chair, and Lelouch couldn't help but notice that her knee was pressing up against his own. As was her thigh. "But if you want to let it rest for now, Lelouch, that's fine. Be a party pooper. I'll just take a nap instead of putting up with your no-fun anti-antics." "Killing a bishop doesn't count as an antic?" Lelouch thought incredulously, but held his tongue even as Millie spread the blanket over them both and leaned into his shoulder. After all she had done to help him, well, I'll let her have her fun for now. And she had provided an abundance of help over the last few months, while Lelouch could travel freely through the settlement and the concession. A Britannian among Britannians, a lone man was suspicious, especially if he kept stopping in bars, coffee shops, and churches. A man roaming with a pretty girl on his arm, however, was a man about town, taking his lover out on a date. That said date had a handbag full of true Anglican literature that she slipped under placemats and between the leaves of hymnals and library books was lost completely on whatever eyes might have noticed her. And that doesn't even touch on her efficacy as a recruiter. As it turned out, soldiers, clerks, and workers were all eager to open their hearts to a pretty and attentive girl who seemed not only receptive but happy to listen to their gripes and concerns. The knowledge of which she always passed to Lelouch, who tailored his recruitment pitch to each prospective recruit individually. "For all of that, she can have my shoulder for an hour," he decided, looking down at the apparently already sleeping Millie. She had been up late the night before, he knew, working hard editing the video that would announce the death of Lazaro Pulse and the resurrection of the true church from the graveyard of history. With that in mind, it's the least I can do. An hour passed, and then another. Just as the clock ticked toward midnight and Lelouch's swelling unease grew almost uncontrollable, the phone rang again. This time, the phone number was Sergeant Coffin's. "Alexander," the noncom said as soon as Lelouch picked up, sirens wailing in the background. "Headquarters has declared a state of lockdown across all installations manned by the 32nd. Scuttlebutt has it that it's just the honorary barracks going into lockdown for now, but that might change. No explanations given so far. I'll get back to you if that changes." The line went dead before Lelouch could reply. "Best of luck, Roger," he said to the empty room anyway, putting the phone back down on the desk. "Best of luck to us all." Ironically enough, determining whether or not the assassination attempt had been successful was perhaps the greatest blind spot in Lelouch's entire plan. Havelock would be long gone from the scene by the time the bishop slipped between the sheets, and any stranger lingering outside the bishop's palace to monitor traffic would soon have cause to regret it from within their new holding cell. Ultimately, Father Alexander had commanded the soldiers and low-ranking bureaucrats of his congregation to alert him of any unusual developments. Coffin's heads up about an entire honorary legion being placed into lockdown was just an example of just such an unusual development that could mark the successful assassination of Bishop Lazaro, but it could also mark the failed assassination of that same worthy, Lelouch considered, drumming his fingers against the desk. Or it could be in regards to something entirely independent of our operation. Putting out the announcement claiming responsibility without certain proof of success is a gamble, both because the true Anglican cause would look foolish if Pulse takes to the pulpit at Tokyo Cathedral tomorrow, alive and healthy, and because it would spoil the element of surprise. On the other hand, the attempt has already been made and the diocese's coffers are rapidly being emptied. It's a little late to hedge my bets. As Millie's artfully assembled video announcing the excommunication of Bishop Lazaro from both the Company of the Faithful and the Mortal Coil went live on half a dozen sites simultaneously, with multiple download links to the trove of evidence Lelouch had retrieved posted in the comments, Lelouch wondered how Viceregal Governor La Bretagne, the third Prince Clovis, would respond to the death of one of his closest advisors. Whatever he decides, Lelouch knew, it's all but guaranteed that Clovis will find some new and innovative way to fuck it all up. Content with the night's work, Lelouch allowed himself to lean back into Millie, his eyes slipping shut. They'd have to wake early, he knew, to sneak back to Ashford's campus before they were missed, but for now, let us rest, content that the fruits of our labor are coming to fruition at last. August 1, 2016 ATB. Prince Clovis's personal study, Viceregal Palace, Britannian Concession, Tokyo Settlement, 0455. And thankfully one of the maids managed to behead the serpent before it could bite anyone else or escape, said the agent, flipping his notebook shut. As soon as the snake, a Western taipan, we believe, was killed, paramedics evacuated His Eminence to the Nunnally Vi Britannia Memorial Hospital where the receiving doctors declared him dead on arrival. The Viceregal Governor, hollow-eyed despite 4 cups of coffee after a sleepless night and slumped so far over that he was practically sliding out of his chair, nodded jerkily and beckoned the agent to continue. The contrast to the ramrod-straight posture of the Royal Guard standing vigilantly at a stiff parade rest directly behind the prince's armchair drove the pathetic display up to the very line of farce. Investigations are of course still underway, reported the agent, smothering his momentary amusement at the state of his natural superior, both in regards to the exact circumstances leading up to His Eminence's unfortunate demise and the video released in the wake of his passing, which had been, in the agent's opinion, a brilliant move. Not only had the brief video been extremely memorable, but the soundtrack that played over the opening and closing moments had been simple enough that anybody could hum it and incredibly catchy. Paired with the continued lack of success in scrubbing the thing from the internet, half of the area's population had likely watched the video at least once already. Even if we somehow managed to remove it from the public's view entirely, the horse has already fled the stable. The narrative has been set. Heretics. Clovis snarled, outrage breathing temporary vitality into his fatigued, hungover frame. Heretics here, in my area. He glared balefully at the agent, who met the prince's eyes with bland equanimity. Why didn't the inquisitors know about this infestation? Because, as intelligence operatives, they are entirely worthless, the agent silently answered, sure that similar thoughts were passing through the mute guard's mind as well. Because their methods, rewarding false accusations and pursuing confessions through whatever means necessary, are best used to terrorize a population back into line rather than to actually identify and disrupt organized opposition. The Holy Office has assured the Directorate that the heretic population is quite negligible and entirely confined to the lower orders, the agent replied smoothly, neatly deflecting the blame. The purges were, of course, quite thorough, and the benefits the Reformed creed endowed upon the nobility obvious. As such, the ranking inquisitor for the area decided that the Holy Office's resources were best devoted to hunting crypto-papists hiding amongst the commoner populations hailing from the old areas. Well, that certainly was a wonderful choice, wasn't it? The Viceregal Governor said with biting sarcasm, throwing up his hands with a touch of his usual theatricality. First they couldn't find anything on that jumped-up honorary, and now they dropped the ball so hard their own bishop got killed. I cannot speak to the efficacy of my colleagues in the Holy Office, said the agent, pausing pointedly to convey his unspoken opinion about that efficacy, but I can assure you that the Directorate has already begun our analysis of the alleged evidence released, presumably by the perpetrators of the murder, in concert with the propaganda video. And what a damning packet it is, that evidence. Every sin of the Church, every blemish on her face, all laid bare in the microcosm of the actions of a single bishop. The secret leveler shook his head, amazed despite himself. Lunatic zealots they might be, this true Church of Britannia has just released the single greatest argument against canon law and canon courts we could hope for. Clerical hands, rich with stolen lucre, dismissing their own crimes from the judge's chair with prejudice and tasking the in-house enforcers with harassing those who would stand against them. Absurd. Regrettably, the agent continued at Clovis's irate prompting gestures, none of the material seems to be falsified in any way we can distinguish. Our analysts have yet to complete the process of cross-checking names and numbers, of course, but from what progress they have achieved thus far, the Diocese of Tokyo was almost certainly responsible for one of the largest money laundering operations I have ever heard of in the service of tax evasion. Beyond laundering the money of others, the diocese and Bishop Lazaro appear to have misappropriated tens of millions of pounds, both from donations and from Bishop Lazaro's ministerial budget. Clovis waved dismissively, still frowning though the agent noticed how he relaxed in his chair. All money problems. Nobody will care about something so grimy and base. Everybody will have forgotten about all of this nastiness within a week. Unfortunately, Your Highness, I doubt we will be so lucky, the agent said, shaking his head regretfully. It also seems like the Bishopric of Tokyo was deeply involved in the misappropriation and unlicensed trafficking of conscripted numbers as well. While the bulk of the conscripted labor was put on the usual tasks, it seems like a fair number were assigned to a number of companies that do not, in fact, exist. And? Clovis blinked, his near stupor resuming as his interest in the conversation waned again. Who cares? There's no end to the numbers. If we want more, we can find them. A handful going missing here or there doesn't matter. Generally, you would be correct, Your Highness, the agent conceded, bowing his head. However, one of those shell companies was also the listed purchaser for a large consignment of medical and surgical supplies. The Directorate noted this in the context of a different investigation, so the company's name is flagged. This combination of medical supplies and disposable bodies in a single entity raises worrying questions. And now, the agent noted, his ineptness has gone quite still in his chair, he isn't bored now, nor half asleep. Interesting. Humph, Clovis snorted condescendingly a moment late, his usual impeccable stage timing notably off. Sounds like nothing more outlandish than a simple harvesting operation. But, oh, fine. I suppose if the rabble got wind of this detail, they might raise a fuss. So many weeds in my garden. It's so difficult to stay on top of them all. His eyes flashed to the agent, intense and fearful despite the bravado. I will be expecting another briefing on this shell company. No later than this afternoon. Instruct the analysts that discovering the extent of this rot is a priority. Understood? Yes, Your Highness, the agent replied, raising fist to chest. It will be done. Every available analyst will be tasked with following this lead. Good, good. Clovis sank back into his chair, his hand questing toward a steaming cup of coffee waiting on a table nearby, where another soldier from the guard had left the carafe before taking up a station outside the door. Clovis, it seemed, wasn't feeling particularly trusting toward his household staff at the moment. Be off with you, then. I have much to attend to. By your leave, Your Highness, murmured the agent, backing out of the room and closing the door behind him. He was eager to carry out the viceregal governor's instructions, though not for reasons Clovis was likely to appreciate. Unlike most of my interactions with the man, the agent thought, nodding to the brace of royal guards stationed in front of the door, who didn't return the gesture, that conversation lacked an audience beyond his bodyguard. As we are both his sworn and trusty servants, it's unlikely that Clovis was manufacturing his reactions. Why would he bother, after all? So his reactions were likely sincere, most especially his sudden interest in the company purchasing human meat and medical supplies. Now, Clovis could be correct about its nature as an organ harvesting operation, the agent conceded as he made his way through the Viceroy's palace, returning to the sub-basement domain of the Directorate. It would explain both of the purchases, but the reaction from the royal pain doesn't match something so pedestrian. And, the agent thought, turning his mind back toward a meeting months in the past, all the way back in the April springtime, Clovis is always talking to General Aspirus of the Special Weapons Corps, isn't he? They are good friends. Perhaps good enough friends that Aspirus was able to convince Clovis to sign off on some special project sufficiently secret or grotesque that it had to be kept off even the Corps official books? If Clovis didn't know about Pulsed's operation or didn't know the full expanse of that operation, he could have simply told his most trusted advisor to handle the matter. But if he was fully aware of Pulsed's operation, a conspirator rather than a dupe, perhaps he used the machine Pulsed had built to launder both money and responsibility? But why? What could possibly justify such secrecy? The mind boggled at the implications. If it is something that the prince wants to hide, the leveler resolved, then it is something that the people must learn about. To protect the common welfare, this investigation must proceed, and as soon as the prince tells us to stop, that's when the real work shall begin.